Long before there were witches, monsters, or even the kingdoms we know today, there was a single event that changed the world forever: the conjunction of the spheres. For a brief moment, countless worlds collided. Entire species were thrown into unfamiliar lands. Monsters appeared where they had never existed before, and humanity found itself in a world that was never meant to be its home. Nearly every major event in the Witcher universe can be traced back to that one catastrophic collision. In this video, we'll explore the complete history of the conjunction of the spheres, what caused it, what happened during it, how it transformed the continent, and why its effects are still being felt centuries later. We'll follow the lore from the earliest known events through to the games, separating established canon from the mysteries that still remain. So get comfortable, and let's go back to the moment the worlds collided. The complete history of the conjunction of the spheres. Before there was a continent, before there was a Geralt, before anyone had a reason to fear the sound of claws on stone, there was no single world at all. There were countless worlds, spheres of existence layered against each other like pages in a book nobody had opened yet. Each one evolved on its own terms, with its own sky, its own predators, its own slow accumulation of history. None of them touched. None of them knew the others were there. A creature born in one sphere lived and died without ever suspecting that a few feet away, in a direction that didn't exist yet, another world was doing the exact same thing with entirely different rules. That isolation is the detail worth sitting with, because everything that eventually went wrong on the continent only went wrong because the isolation ended. Each sphere had spent however long it needed becoming exactly what it was going to be. Ecosystems settled into balance. Predators found their prey and stayed within reach of it. Whatever intelligent life existed in a given world built its villages and its wars and its gods around the specific shape of that one reality, with no reason to prepare for anything else, because there was nothing else. It's easy, hearing this now, to treat it as a footnote before the real story starts. It wasn't a footnote. It was the last era in which any of these worlds got to be simple. The scale involved is difficult to picture, and the games are honest about how difficult it is. Some spheres shared enough similarity that a creature crossing from one to the other could survive the trip, and even thrive. Others were closer to nightmares, environments so far removed from anything familiar that nothing which belonged there could have made sense in a world like the continent. And nothing from the continent would have lasted an hour in return. That range matters, because it explains why what came later was so uneven. Some of what arrived on the continent adapted easily. Other things barely understood where they'd landed. What none of these worlds had, prior to what was coming, was contact. No sphere had a reason to develop defenses against visitors from somewhere else, because the very idea of somewhere else wasn't something most of these worlds had any concept of. The Elle, the elves who'd later mastered the crossing between dimensions, were the exception, and even they were operating with limited and fading knowledge, rather than some settled and total mastery of the process. Everyone else, every gnome, every dwarf, every early and struggling human community scattered across whatever sphere it called home, existed in complete ignorance of what was coming. This is why the conjunction of the spheres was catastrophic, rather than merely disruptive. It wasn't an invasion that a defended border could have slowed down. It was every wall between every isolated reality failing at once, without warning, without the centuries of gradual contact that might have let anyone prepare. What followed on the continent was the direct result of that isolation, ending in the worst possible way. And to understand any of it, the elves, the monsters, the witches, the wars that never really stopped, you have to start here, in the quiet before it happened, when a world could still exist without knowing what else was out there. Part 2. The first known world. Long before elves ever set foot on the continent, long before the word monster meant anything more than a story told to frighten children, the land belonged to two races who'd never fought a war worth remembering against each other. The gnomes were there first, as far as anyone can trace it, a small and quiet people, with no particular ambition to rule anything beyond their own settlements. They lived close to the earth, worked with herbs and modest crafts, and left behind almost nothing in the way of grand architecture or grand conquest, because grandeur was never the point of how they lived. The dwarves arrived after them, coming from origins nobody has ever fully pinned down, and what's notable about that arrival is how little violence came with it. Two races that could easily have gone to war over land instead settled into something closer to coexistence. The dwarves brought a relationship with stone and mining that the gnomes didn't share, carving out communities in the mountains that would eventually become the foundation for places like Mahakam, one of the few settlements from this era that's still standing, in one form or another. By the time Geralt is riding through the world it left behind, what made this early period different from everything that followed wasn't peace exactly. Gnomes and dwarves had their disputes, their competition over resources, their own internal politics that any two long-lived races sharing a continent were bound to develop. What made it different was scale. There was no third or fourth or fifth power pulling at the same land. There was no war that swallowed entire kingdoms, because there were no kingdoms yet, just settlements that grew at whatever pace their inhabitants were comfortable with, in a world that wasn't yet being fought over by everyone with a claim to it. The natural world these two races shared was also, by every account the games and their surrounding lore offer, simpler than what came later. The animals were dangerous in the ordinary way that animals are dangerous, requiring caution rather than a witch's blade. There was no ecological pressure from creatures that didn't belong there, because nothing from another sphere had crossed over yet. The balance that existed was the kind that takes centuries to establish and can be destroyed in an afternoon, and neither the gnomes nor the dwarves had any reason to suspect that the ground beneath that balance was about to shift. This is the continent that almost nobody in Geralt's era remembers, and that even the elves who arrived after this period only encountered secondhand, through what the gnomes and dwarves could tell them. It's worth holding on to, though, because it's the baseline against which everything else gets measured. Every later argument about who the land really belongs to, every claim the elves make about being the true and ancient stewards of the continent, runs into the inconvenient fact that somebody was there before them too, quietly, without armies, doing nothing more dramatic than living. Part 3. The arrival of the elves. The elves who'd come to dominate the continent, the ones later known as the Seidhe, didn't originate there. This gets lost sometimes in how completely they came to define the land, but the dwarf Yarpen Zigrin lays it out plainly to Ciri, that the elves arrived by sea on white ships, roughly 1,000 years before humans ever set foot on the same shores. Wherever those ships came from, whatever world or coastline they'd left behind, the elves who stepped off them weren't refugees in the way humans would later be. They came with knowledge, with magic, and with an ease that suggested this wasn't their first arrival, somewhere unfamiliar. What they found was a land already occupied by gnomes and dwarves, and the elves didn't extend to the elder races the courtesy that the dwarves and gnomes had extended to each other. Some accounts suggest agreement, land granted rather than seized. Others describe outright conflict, the elves asserting dominance through the simple fact that they were stronger, longer lived, and considerably more skilled in the use of magic than anyone already living there. Whichever version carries more truth, and the lore doesn't fully settle it, the outcome was the same. The elves became the dominant intelligent race across most of the continent within a relatively short span of time. They built accordingly. Cities rose in forests in a way that worked with the landscape rather than against it. Towers that served as more than decoration, functioning as points of reference for magical travel across the land. Some of what they built has survived into Geralt's era as ruins, still standing after 1,500 years of neglect and war. A testament to how far beyond ordinary construction their methods went. The elves weren't just settling the continent, they were reshaping it into something that reflected how they understood the world, long-lived, connected to older forces, built to last far longer than anything a human would ever construct. Their relationship with magic in this period was different from what would come later, more intuitive, drawn from the natural world itself, rather than the structured and formal spellcasting that humans would eventually develop. This wasn't chaos in the form the games describe it, because chaos as a defining force hadn't entered the world yet. It was something older and quieter, tied to the land the elves now called their own. And it gave them a command over their surroundings that made them feel, understandably, like the permanent and rightful rulers of everything they could see. That sense of permanence is worth remembering, because nothing about what the elves built or believed prepared them for what was coming. They'd arrived from somewhere else and made themselves masters of a new home. And by every measure available to them, that mastery looked complete and looked lasting. The continent under Seidhe rule was, for a long stretch of history, exactly what they wanted it to be. It would not stay that way, and no one among them, for all their long lives and their command of old magic, saw the shape of what was going to take it from them. Part 4. The Elle before the catastrophe. Not every elf made the crossing to the continent. Somewhere in the deep history that predates even the Seidhe's arrival by sea, the elven people split, and one branch went a different direction entirely, settling a separate world rather than the one gnomes and dwarves already called home. These were the Elle, and their story runs parallel to the Seidhe's for most of its length before eventually crashing straight into it, centuries later, in the form of Seidhe and the riders who came looking for her. The world the Elle settled wasn't empty. They found it already inhabited by unicorns, a species with abilities the elves recognized immediately as valuable. A natural command over movement between dimensions that mirrored what the Elle themselves were trying to master through study and magic rather than instinct. What followed was not friendship. The relationship between the Elle and the unicorns of their world became one of the oldest and most persistent conflicts in elven history. A war fought over an ability that one side had been born with and the other side desperately wanted. Culturally, the Elle diverged from their cousins on the continent in ways that go beyond geography. Where the Seidhe built cities that worked with forests and rivers, the Elle built a civilization centered on Ithlinne, ruled for a long stretch of their history by a king named Oberon Mursatak, and shaped by ambitions that had less to do with living alongside a new world, and more to do with controlling it completely. They were, by most accounts that survive into Geralt's era, colder in temperament and considerably more comfortable with domination as a governing principle than the elves who'd settled among gnomes and dwarves. What set the Elle apart most sharply, though, was their relationship with the space between worlds. Before the conjunction of the spheres ever happened, the Elle had already developed the ability to travel between dimensions, a power that predates the catastrophe entirely, and makes them, in a real sense, the reason the concept of moving between spheres existed at all, before it became a shared and chaotic possibility for everyone else. This ability shaped everything about how they saw themselves, as a people meant to move beyond the boundaries other races were confined by. That confidence, like the confidence of the Seidhe on the continent, would eventually run into a wall it hadn't anticipated. The conjunction was coming for both branches of the elven people, and it would treat the Elle's mastery of interdimensional travel as something to be stripped away rather than protected, a loss that would define the next 1,500 years of their history and eventually drive them straight into Ciri's path. Part 5. Traveling between worlds before the conjunction. The idea of moving freely between separate spheres of existence sounds, from the continent's perspective in Geralt's time, like something closer to myth than history. Portals in his era are unstable, dangerous, and often the product of desperate magic rather than reliable technique. But before the conjunction, at least for the Elle, that kind of travel was closer to routine. It required skill, certainly, and it required knowledge that had been developed and refined over a very long time. But it wasn't the once-in-a-generation event that a stable crossing between worlds would become afterward. This connectivity relied on things the lore only partially explains: ancient gateways, and a depth of magical understanding that the Elle had built up over centuries of study, possibly drawing on knowledge tied to the unicorns whose natural ability they'd been fighting to understand and eventually replicate. Whether the Elle ever fully matched what the unicorns could do instinctively, or whether their method was always a slower and more effortful imitation of a gift they didn't naturally possess, is one of the questions the lore leaves open rather than answered outright. What matters for understanding the scale of what was lost is this. Before the conjunction, The universe wasn't the fragmented and dangerous patchwork of isolated worlds that most of its inhabitants believed it to be. For at least one race, it was something closer to a network. Worlds that could be reached deliberately, rather than stumbled into by accident. That distinction gets erased almost entirely once the conjunction happens, replaced by a chaotic and unpredictable version of interdimensional contact that nobody, not even the NL, could fully control anymore. It's worth being honest about how much of this remains speculative rather than confirmed in detail. The games and their surrounding lore establish that this earlier, more stable form of travel existed, and that the NL were its primary practitioners, but the exact mechanics, how the gateways worked, what made them stable, why they eventually failed, are treated with the kind of vagueness that suggests even the elves who lived through the transition didn't fully understand what they'd lost, until it was already gone. What can be said with more confidence is the consequence. A universe that had been, for a narrow slice of its inhabitants, genuinely connected became, almost overnight, a collection of worlds thrown together by catastrophe rather than intention. The NL went from travelers who chose their destinations to a people locked mostly out of the door they used to walk through freely. And that loss, more than any single grievance that would come later, is the wound that shapes everything the Wild Hunt eventually becomes. Part 6. Magic before chaos changed everything. It's tempting to assume that magic on the continent has always worked the way it does in Geralt's era, drawn from chaos, channeled by mages who've spent years training their bodies and minds to withstand what that channeling costs them. The truth, as far as the lore is willing to commit to one, is that this version of magic is relatively young, a direct product of the conjunction, rather than something that existed on the continent from the beginning. Before the catastrophe, whatever magic the elves practiced worked on entirely different terms. The elves who lived on the continent before the conjunction, and likely the ANL in their own world as well, drew on something older and less structured. A connection to the natural world itself, rather than a distinct and separate force that had to be summoned and controlled. This isn't presented as a fully mapped system in the games. It's presented as a contrast, a way of explaining why elven magic in Geralt's era still feels different from human sorcery, more instinctive, less reliant on the formal training that defines the Brotherhood of Sorcerers. What's confirmed and what's speculation matters a great deal here, because this is one of the areas where fan explanation has filled in far more detail than the source material actually provides. The games establish clearly that chaos, the force that powers spellcasting as Geralt understands it, entered the world through the conjunction. What they don't do is offer a detailed account of what, precisely, elven magic looked like before that happened, how it was learned, what its limits were, or whether it functioned as a completely separate force from chaos, or an earlier and gentler version of the same thing. This gap is worth sitting in, rather than papering over. The temptation, when telling a story like this one, is to smooth out the uncertainty and present a tidy history where every question has an answer. But the honest version is that this period of magic's history is one of the most thinly documented stretches in the entire timeline, known mostly through implication and the assumption that something had to exist before chaos, since the elves were clearly using magic long before humans arrived with their sphere destroyed behind them. What can be said is the effect. Whatever magic existed before the conjunction, it wasn't the volatile, costly, sometimes body-altering force that mages in Geralt's world have to reckon with. The arrival of chaos didn't just add a new tool to the world. It appears to have replaced or absorbed whatever came before it so thoroughly that by the time humans built their formal institutions around it, the older magic had become something closer to legend, remembered mostly through what the elves still carried in how they used their own gifts. Part 7. The balance of the ancient world. There's a particular stillness to how the games and their surrounding history describe the continent in the centuries before the conjunction, and it's worth resisting the urge to romanticize it too heavily. This wasn't a paradise. The elder races had their conflicts, their hierarchies, their moments of cruelty toward each other that had nothing to do with any outside threat. But it was a world operating within limits that everyone living in it understood, a closed system where the dangers, however real, were dangers the inhabitants had generations of experience managing. The relationship between gnomes, dwarves, and elves during this period wasn't equal, and it's worth being clear about that rather than smoothing it into something friendlier than it was. The elves, once they arrived and established dominance, held the most power, and the balance that existed was closer to an uneasy hierarchy than a genuine partnership between races. Still, that hierarchy had settled into something predictable. Wars happened and ended. Territories shifted, but slowly, over generations rather than overnight, in a way that let each race adapt rather than simply survive. The natural world followed a similar logic. Whatever dangerous animals existed, and there would always have been some, they belonged to this world in a way the later monsters never did. They had evolved alongside the ecosystems they lived in, kept in check by predators and by the limits of their own environment. There was no sudden influx of creatures with no natural place in the food chain, no ghouls arriving in a world that had never developed anything to compete with them. The threats were real, but they were threats the world had already learned to absorb. Politically, the continent before the conjunction lacked the scale of conflict that would come to define it afterward. There were no northern kingdoms locked in generational war, no empire in the south with ambitions of conquest stretching across an entire landmass, because there was no reason yet for politics to operate at that scale. Whatever governance existed among the elder races was regional, tied to specific settlements and specific disputes, without the pressure of a rapidly expanding and aggressively territorial species pushing against every border at once. This is why the period gets remembered, when it gets remembered at all, as a kind of final age. Not because it was gentle or fair, but because it was the last stretch of history where the rules were stable enough that a person, or an elf, or a dwarf could reasonably expect the world they died in to resemble the world they were born into. Everything that followed the conjunction broke that expectation permanently, and the ancient balance became something the continent would spend the next 1,500 years failing to fully recover. Part 8. The Great Unknown Beyond the Spheres. For everything the lore is willing to confirm about the conjunction and its aftermath, there remains an enormous amount left in the dark. And most of it concerns the other worlds. The continent is one sphere among what the games suggest were dozens, possibly hundreds, of separate realities that existed before the catastrophe and were affected by it in ways that were never explored in detail. What happened to those worlds, what became of the creatures and races that called them home, is one of the largest gaps in the entire history. Some of these other spheres are known only because something crossed over from them and ended up on the continent. A handful of monster types are explicitly tied to origins beyond this world, creatures whose biology makes no sense within continental ecosystems because they didn't evolve within them. Beyond that, though, the specifics thin out quickly. There's no comprehensive map of the other spheres, no catalogue of what other civilizations might have existed and been thrown into the same chaos that reshaped the continent. The NL's world is the clearest exception, simply because Ciri's story eventually takes both her and the player there directly. But even that world, with its unicorns and its city of Ithlinne, is presented as one sphere among many, rather than a complete picture of what else is out there. The implication, never stated outright but present throughout the games, is that the conjunction's effects were felt across a scale far larger than anything the continent alone could illustrate, and that most of that larger story simply isn't told. This is one of the places where the instinct to invent detail has to be resisted the hardest. It would be easy to fill in the unknown spheres with confident description, to name their creatures and their politics, and pretend the games said more than they actually did. They don't. What they offer instead is scale without specifics. A sense that the conjunction was a catastrophe measured in worlds rather than regions, without ever confirming exactly how many worlds, or what most of them looked like before everything changed. What survives of this uncertainty is, in its own way, part of the point. The continent's inhabitants, from Geralt's era all the way back to the first generation that lived through the conjunction, never had access to the full picture either. They knew their own world had been invaded by something they couldn't fully explain, and they built their understanding out of what little evidence made it through. The great unknown beyond the spheres isn't a gap the story failed to fill. It's a reminder that nobody living inside this history ever got to see the whole of it. And neither, fully, do we. Part 9. What the conjunction of the spheres actually was. 1500 years before Geralt was ever handed over to the witches of Kaer Morhen, every barrier separating the countless spheres of existence failed at once. That's the core of it, stripped down to the plainest possible version. The conjunction of the spheres was the moment when isolated worlds, each of which had spent unknown ages developing on its own terms, suddenly touched, merged, and in some cases collided outright, with no warning and no mechanism by which anyone living through it could have prepared. The games are careful, and appropriately so, about how much they claim to know regarding the cause. It's described as an astronomical or dimensional catastrophe, but the deeper why, what specifically triggered it, whether it was a natural failure of the boundaries between worlds, or something closer to an accident caused by beings capable of moving between spheres already, is never pinned down with certainty. Fans have built theories around this gap for years, and some of those theories are compelling. None of them carry the weight of confirmed lore, and it's worth being honest about that distinction, rather than presenting a guess as settled history. What is confirmed is the result. Worlds that had never touched suddenly existed in the same space, and everything native to those worlds, populations, creatures, entire ecosystems, found itself displaced into environments it had never evolved to survive in. This wasn't a slow migration. It happened, by every account, over a compressed and violent stretch of time, long enough to permanently reshape reality, and short enough that nobody caught in the middle of it had any real chance to understand what was happening until it was already over. The scale is what separates the conjunction from anything else in the setting's history. This wasn't one army invading one kingdom. It was every closed system in an unknown number of separate universes failing simultaneously, dumping their contents into whichever neighboring sphere happened to be on the other side of the collapse. The continent was one of the worlds that ended up receiving the overflow, and it received a great deal of it. Monsters, humans, and an entirely new form of magical energy, all arriving within the same general window of catastrophe. It's worth returning, before moving further into the details, to what the conjunction wasn't. It wasn't a war. It wasn't a plan carried out by any faction with a goal in mind. As far as the confirmed lore is willing to say, it was closer to a natural disaster on a scale that dwarfs anything else in the setting. Indifferent to who or what it displaced, and the continent that Geralt eventually inherits is, in every meaningful sense, built entirely out of its wreckage. Part 10. The collision of worlds. Picture the moment the boundaries gave way, not as a single dramatic instant, but as a rupture that spread across an unknown number of separate realities at roughly the same time. On one side of that rupture, a sphere with its own landscape and its own inhabitants existed exactly as it had for however long it had been developing. On the other side, a different sphere with entirely different rules did the same. When the boundary between them failed, both worlds bled into each other, and nothing about that bleeding was gentle. Landscapes themselves weren't spared. There are suggestions throughout the lore that entire stretches of terrain, and the creatures native to them, ended up transplanted wholesale into environments that had nothing in common with where they'd come from. This is part of why the continent's ecology in Geralt's era feels so patched together, why certain creatures seem to belong to entirely different logics of biology than others living in the same forest. They do. They came from different places, and the conjunction is the only reason they ended up sharing the same ground. Populations were displaced the same way landscapes were. This is where humanity enters the story, though not in a single unified wave. Different groups arrived at different points, some during the initial catastrophe itself, and some considerably later, having survived on the fringes of the chaos before finally reaching the continent. Whatever world humanity had called home before this, it was destroyed in the process, which is part of why humans arrived with nothing but what they could carry, and a complete unfamiliarity with the land they now had to survive in. The energy released by the collision was its own kind of displacement, and this is where the roots of everything that follows regarding magic begin. Whatever force powers chaos in Geralt's world wasn't native to the continent before this event. It arrived alongside everything else, saturating the environment in a way that would eventually make magic accessible to anyone with the right inherited aptitude. A fact that had consequences nobody caught in the middle of the collision could have anticipated. What ties all of this together is permanence. A landscape that gets bent out of shape by a storm eventually recovers. What the conjunction did wasn't temporary. The worlds that collided didn't separate again afterward. Not fully. Whatever mixing happened in that catastrophic window became the new baseline, and the continent that emerged on the other side of it was permanently altered rather than merely disturbed. A fact that every subsequent chapter of its history has had to reckon with. Part 11. The arrival of chaos. Before the conjunction, whatever magic existed on the continent belonged to the elves and worked on older, quieter terms. What arrived with the collision of the spheres was something categorically different. A force the games and their surrounding lore call chaos, and its entrance into the world is treated as one of the single most consequential effects of the entire catastrophe. Chaos didn't refine what already existed. It introduced an entirely new kind of power, one that saturated the continent in a way the older elven magic never had. What makes chaos distinct is its accessibility, at least relative to what came before. Elven magic, by most accounts, was tied closely to long lifespans and an intuitive relationship with the natural world that took centuries to develop properly. Chaos, once it entered the continent, became something that certain humans could tap into as well, provided they had the genetic aptitude for it. A fact that would eventually produce the first human mages, and much later, the formal institutions built around controlling and teaching that ability. This shift reshaped nature itself, not just the people capable of using it. Monsters that arrived through the conjunction found themselves in a world now saturated with this new energy, and some of what makes certain creatures dangerous in ways that go beyond simple predation traces back to this saturation. Curses, mutations, and the more unnatural corners of the continent's ecology are all, in one way or another, downstream of chaos, having entered a world that had never had to account for it before. It's worth being precise about what the games actually confirm here, since this is an area where the temptation to over-explain runs high. Chaos is established as the foundation for spellcasting, and it's established as having arrived through the conjunction, rather than existing on the continent beforehand. What the lore doesn't do is offer a tidy scientific account of what chaos actually is, on a fundamental level, whether it's a substance, a force, or something closer to a property of reality itself. That ambiguity is part of the setting, not a gap that needs filling with invented certainty. What can be said plainly is the consequence for everyone living on the continent afterward. Magic stopped being something only the elves could meaningfully practice. It became a resource, unevenly distributed, dangerous to use without training, and eventually the foundation for entire political institutions. None of that existed before the conjunction. All of it exists because chaos arrived alongside everything else that came pouring through when the spheres collided. Part 12. When monsters entered the world. Of everything that crossed over during the conjunction, monsters are the legacy that shaped the continent most directly, because they're the reason the entire profession of Witcher would eventually need to exist. Before the collision of the spheres, the games are consistent in suggesting that nothing resembling the ghouls, drowners, wraiths, and other creatures Geralt spends his career hunting had any presence on the continent at all. They belong to other worlds, other spheres, with their own evolutionary histories, and the conjunction is the only reason they ended up here. What made their arrival so devastating wasn't just their danger individually. It was the fact that they arrived in a world with no natural defenses against them. A creature that had spent countless generations evolving alongside specific predators, specific prey, and a specific ecological niche in its home sphere suddenly found itself in an environment with none of those checks in place. Nothing on the continent had evolved to compete with a ghoul's appetite or a drowner's ambush tactics, because nothing on the continent had ever needed to. This absence of natural predators is a large part of why so many monster species didn't just survive the transition, but thrived in it. A creature dropped into a hostile, unfamiliar world with no competition for the resources it needed, has an easier time establishing itself than one arriving into an ecosystem already full of rivals. The continent, in the earliest years after the conjunction, offered exactly that kind of opening, and the monster population expanded accordingly, unchecked by anything except the growing desperation of the people now forced to share the land with them. It's important not to flatten every monster into the same category of malevolent invader, because the lore doesn't support that reading. Most of these creatures weren't evil in any deliberate sense. They were doing what they'd evolved to do, hunting, feeding, defending territory, in a world that simply had no framework for absorbing that behavior without significant loss of life on the human and elven side. The horror of the situation wasn't cruelty, it was mismatch. An entire category of predator introduced into an environment with no evolved resistance to it. The devastation this caused across the early centuries following the conjunction is treated by the games as significant enough to explain, on its own, why something as extreme as the Witcher profession eventually became necessary. Ordinary soldiers, ordinary hunters, even the elder races with their older and more established relationship to the land, weren't equipped for what had arrived. The monsters didn't just change the ecology of the continent, they changed what kind of world it was possible to live in, and that change is the direct root of everything that follows. Part 13. The arrival of humanity. Humanity's presence on the continent is one of the more layered parts of this history, because unlike the monsters, humans didn't arrive as a single event. The lore describes an earlier wave, sometimes referred to in elven accounts as the Dork and Wasgore peoples, who appeared during the conjunction itself, their original world destroyed in the same catastrophe that displaced everything else. What became of these earliest human arrivals isn't entirely clear, and the games leave room for the possibility that they didn't survive long enough to leave much of a mark. The wave that actually shaped the continent's future arrived considerably later, in an event history would eventually call the First Landing. These were the Nordlings, the ancestors of the human kingdoms that Geralt's era takes for granted, and their arrival came hundreds of years after the conjunction itself, rather than during it. By the time they landed, the continent had already been reshaped by centuries of monsters and elven dominance, and the world these humans stepped into was already dangerous in ways their own destroyed sphere may or may not have prepared them for. Where humanity originally came from is one of the questions the lore treats honestly as unresolved. Avalak, in his account to Ciri, describes humans as having arrived from a world they themselves destroyed, which frames them, from an elven perspective, as something closer to another invasive species than a race with any legitimate claim to the continent. That framing is worth noting as a perspective rather than an objective account, since it comes from a character with every reason to resent humanity's later dominance over his own people. What's not in dispute is what humanity did once it arrived. Unlike the gnomes and dwarves who'd settled the land slowly over centuries, and unlike the elves who'd arrived with magic and confidence already fully formed, humans expanded aggressively and bred at a rate the longer-lived elder races struggled to match. This reproductive speed, more than any single military advantage, is presented as the real engine behind humanity's eventual dominance over a continent it had arrived on as refugees rather than conquerors. The long-term consequence of humanity's arrival is difficult to overstate. Every kingdom, every war between Nilfgaard and the north, every act of persecution against elves and other non-humans that runs through the games traces back to this uneven and often violent process of settlement. Humans didn't just move into a world that already belonged to others. They reshaped it entirely, and they did so within a handful of centuries, a speed that the elder races, for all their power and longevity, never found a way to answer. Part 14. A world that could never be separated again. Once the conjunction had run its course, the continent settled into a new and permanent condition, and the defining feature of that condition was that nothing could be undone. The worlds that had collided didn't separate back into whatever isolation they'd known before. Gnomes, dwarves, elves, the newly arrived humans, and the monsters that had come through alongside them were all now sharing the same land, permanently, whether any of them had consented to the arrangement or not. This forced coexistence is worth dwelling on, because it's easy to describe abstractly and much harder to actually picture. Races that had never needed a framework for dealing with each other because they'd evolved in complete isolation were suddenly required to negotiate territory, resources, and survival with species whose habits, biology, and intentions they had no prior experience with. Some of that negotiation took the form of tense but functional coexistence. Much of it took the form of war, and the earliest wars of this new era set patterns of conflict that would echo for the next 15 centuries. The ecosystems themselves collapsed under the same pressure. Whatever balance the pre-conjunction continent had spent generations establishing between predator and prey. Between elder races and the land they lived on was broken almost immediately by the sudden introduction of creatures the environment had no answer for. Rebuilding any kind of stable balance took centuries, and even then, the balance that eventually formed was different in kind from what had existed before, built around managing threats rather than genuinely resolving them. What makes this period distinct from everything that came before it is the loss of any expectation of stability. In the ancient world, change happened slowly enough that a person could reasonably expect the world they died in to resemble the world they were born into. After the conjunction, that expectation was gone. The continent entered an age defined by instability as its baseline condition. A world where sudden and violent change wasn't the exception to be feared, but the ongoing reality everyone had to build their lives around. This is the true beginning of the history that eventually produces Geralt, Ciri, and every kingdom and conflict that surrounds them, not the conjunction itself, which was over relatively quickly as far as cataclysms go, but the permanent and irreversible mixing it left behind. The continent after the conjunction was not a world recovering from a disaster. It was a new world entirely, built out of the wreckage of several others, and every generation that followed inherited a version of reality that could never go back to what it had been. Part 15. The long-term consequences of the conjunction. It's worth stepping back at this point and naming plainly what the rest of this history is going to keep circling back to. Nearly every major thread running through the Witcher games, the racial tension in Novigrad, the war between the northern kingdoms and Nilfgaard, the existence of witches at all, the Wild Hunt's pursuit of Ciri traces its origin back to this single event. The conjunction isn't background lore sitting quietly behind the story. It's the mechanism that made the story possible in the first place. Consider how directly each major element connects. Monsters exist on the continent because the conjunction brought them there, and witches exist specifically because monsters needed a countermeasure that ordinary humans couldn't provide. Magic, in the form the games present it, exists because chaos entered the world through the same collision. The racial conflict between humans and elves exists because humanity's arrival and subsequent expansion displaced a civilization that had already claimed the continent as its own centuries earlier. None of these are separate stories that happen to share a setting. They're branches of the same root event. Even the Wild Hunt, which might seem like the most distant and self-contained thread in the entire saga, only exists because of what the conjunction did to the NL. Their loss of stable interdimensional travel, the wound that eventually drives Eredin's pursuit of Ciri across multiple games, is a direct consequence of the same catastrophe that scattered monsters across the continent and stripped humanity of its original world. The riders crossing the sky in Geralt's era are still, in a very real sense, dealing with the fallout of an event 1,500 years in the past. This is part of why the conjunction deserves the kind of attention most casual engagement with the series never gives it. It's easy to treat it as a piece of opening exposition, the sort of detail a game's introductory narration mentions once and moves past. But nearly every choice Geralt makes, every war he rides through, every monster he's paid to kill, exists inside a world whose fundamental shape was decided before any of these characters were born, by an event none of them witnessed, and none of them fully understand. What follows in this history is an attempt to trace that shape carefully, from the immediate chaos of the first generations after the conjunction, through the creation of witches, through the rise of the kingdoms and the empire that would eventually go to war with each other, and finally to the Wild Hunt and the Elder Blood that connects all of it back to the moment the spheres collided. None of it happens in isolation. All of it starts here. Part 16, A World in Chaos. The generations immediately following the conjunction of the spheres didn't get the luxury of understanding what had happened to them. They got the aftermath, a continent suddenly full of unfamiliar creatures, unfamiliar people, and an energy in the air that hadn't existed before, with no framework for making sense of any of it. Every race caught in this period, gnomes, dwarves, elves, and the first arriving humans, was working from the same starting point. Nobody knew what the rules were anymore, because the old rules had stopped applying overnight. For the elves, this instability was especially disorienting, because they'd spent centuries believing themselves to be the continent's rightful and permanent rulers. That belief didn't survive contact with a world now overrun by monsters their magic hadn't evolved to counter, and, not long after, by a new species arriving in numbers that kept climbing no matter how many setbacks it suffered. The confidence that had defined Seide's civilization before the conjunction curdled over the following centuries into something closer to a long, slow anxiety about what the future actually held. The monsters themselves were adapting just as urgently, though from a different position entirely. Creatures torn from their native spheres and dropped into unfamiliar terrain had to find, quickly, what in this new world could sustain them. Some failed and vanished within a generation or two, unable to adjust to prey and environments nothing like what they'd evolved for. Others succeeded, sometimes disturbingly well, finding in the continent's post-conjunction chaos exactly the kind of undefended opportunity a predator needs to establish itself permanently. Humans, arriving into the middle of all this, had perhaps the least context of anyone. They'd lost their original world entirely and had nothing to fall back on except whatever they could build from scratch. Early accounts describe communities that were less like settlements and more like survival groups, focused entirely on getting through each season rather than any longer-term ambition. Whatever kingdoms would eventually rise from this beginning were still centuries away, and the humans of this earliest period would have had no reason to imagine them. What defines this stretch of history, more than any single conflict or discovery, is the sheer scale of adjustment required from every side at once. No race got to sit this period out. The gnomes retreated further into isolation. The dwarves sealed themselves deeper into the mountains they already called home. The elves fought to hold on to dominance that was slipping regardless of how hard they fought. And the humans, with nothing left to lose, simply kept arriving, kept surviving, and kept multiplying in a continent that hadn't yet decided what shape it was going to settle into. Part 17. The monsters established their place in the world. As the initial shock of the conjunction faded into something closer to a permanent condition, the creatures that had arrived through the collision began sorting themselves across the continent according to whatever environment best matched what they'd evolved for. This wasn't a coordinated process. Nothing about it involved intention or planning on the monster's part. It was closer to a slow scattering, each species drifting toward whatever corner of the land offered the closest match to conditions it already knew how to survive in. Rivers and wetlands became home to creatures built for ambush and ease of movement through water. The drowners and their relatives finding an easy foothold in terrain that offered both cover and a steady supply of prey along the banks. Forests, dense and largely unpoliced by any organized force strong enough to clear them, became the province of creatures suited to stalking through undergrowth, patient hunters that the elder races had no established method of dealing with. Burial grounds and battlefields, tragically plentiful given how much conflict this early period produced, became a natural draw for the creatures that fed on the dead rather than the living. What's notable about this spread is how quickly it stabilized into something resembling permanence. Within a handful of generations, certain regions of the continent had become known, informally, as territories no sane traveller entered without protection. This wasn't folklore exaggerating a rare threat. It reflected an accurate and grim reality, that entire stretches of otherwise usable land had effectively been ceded to whatever monster population had claimed them, because nothing available to the elder races or the newly arrived humans was equipped to push back. Some species flourished well beyond what their numbers in their original sphere would have suggested was possible. Without natural predators, without the ecological checks that had kept their populations in balance in the world they'd come from, Certain monsters expanded far past sustainable limits by any standard the continent had previously known. This overpopulation is part of why the following centuries would be defined by such relentless and widespread danger, rather than isolated incidents that a community might reasonably prepare for. By the time humanity's numbers had grown large enough to start pushing seriously into contested territory, the monsters weren't intruders anymore. They were established, territorial, and in many cases thriving in a way that made them look, to anyone arriving fresh into the region, like they'd always belonged there. That illusion of permanence, monsters as simply a fact of the landscape rather than a 1,500-year-old consequence of a cosmic accident, is one the continent has never fully shaken. And it started forming in exactly this period. Part 18. Humanity's first settlements. The earliest human communities on the continent bore little resemblance to the walled cities and organized kingdoms that Geralt would eventually ride between. They were small, cautious, and built around the immediate priorities of survival, rather than any longer-term vision of what they might become. Wood and packed earth, rather than stone. Defensive positioning chosen for practical reasons, high ground, easy access to water, proximity to enough open land to grow what a small group needed to eat, rather than any grander strategic thinking. What these earliest settlements had to contend with went well beyond the ordinary hardship of building a new life in unfamiliar territory. They were competing, directly and often violently, with monster populations that had already claimed much of the most desirable land. A settlement built too close to the wrong forest or the wrong stretch of river risked losing people steadily, sometimes catastrophically, to creatures the settlers had no prior experience defending against. Survival in this period wasn't a given. It was a genuine and constant negotiation with a landscape actively working against them. The elder races complicated this picture further, though not always in the way later human accounts would suggest. Some early contact between humans and elves, dwarves, or gnomes involved genuine, if wary, cooperation, trade, and shared knowledge exchanged out of mutual necessity rather than trust. Other encounters were considerably less friendly, particularly as human settlements began expanding into land the elves had already claimed as their own, territory the Iron Seidhe had held for the better part of 1,000 years by that point, and had no interest in surrendering without resistance. What allowed these fragile early settlements to eventually become something more permanent wasn't any single decisive advantage. It was persistence, the same trait that would eventually let humanity outpace every other race on the continent. Communities that failed simply vanished, absorbed by monster attacks, harsh winters, or conflict with the elder races. Communities that survived learned, generation by generation, what worked, and passed that knowledge forward, slowly accumulating the kind of practical expertise that isolated struggle alone can teach. By the time these settlements had grown large enough to be called villages in any meaningful sense, they represented something the continent hadn't seen before. A human presence that wasn't going anywhere no matter how much resistance it met. The elder races, watching this expansion continue despite every setback, were witnessing the first signs of a shift in power that most of them, at this stage, still badly underestimated. Part 19. The elder races respond to humanity. The earliest interactions between humanity and the elder races carried none of the entrenched hostility that would eventually define relations between elves and humans in Geralt's era. Contact in this period was cautious on both sides, shaped more by mutual unfamiliarity than by any existing grievance. Elves, dwarves, and gnomes had centuries of established life on the continent behind them. Humans had nothing but recent arrival, and a desperate need to survive in land that already belonged, by every reasonable measure, to someone else. Some of the earliest recorded exchanges suggest genuine curiosity rather than immediate conflict. Trade occurred. Knowledge occasionally passed between communities, particularly regarding the land itself, which plants were safe, which regions carried the worst monster activity, information that elder races with centuries of accumulated experience could offer, and that humans, still finding their footing, badly needed. This cooperation, where it existed, was never framed as an alliance between equals. It was closer to tolerance, extended cautiously and without any illusion of permanence. That tolerance began eroding as humanity's numbers grew faster than anyone among the elder races had anticipated. Elves in particular, with their long lifespans and correspondingly slow rate of population growth, watched human settlements multiply at a pace that had no equivalent in their own history. What began as scattered and manageable contact started to look, within a few generations, like an encroachment that showed no sign of slowing down. And the elder race's response shifted accordingly, from cautious tolerance toward a hardening suspicion that would eventually calcify into open hostility. Dwarves and gnomes, generally less territorial about open land than the elves, tended to maintain a more stable relationship with the expanding human population for longer, retreating into mountain strongholds and smaller communities rather than contesting every stretch of contested ground directly. This difference in response is part of why dwarves would eventually maintain a more workable, if still uneasy, coexistence with humans in later centuries, while elven relations with humanity deteriorated into the entrenched conflict that defines so much of the continent's later political history. What's crucial to understand about this period is that the later hostility wasn't inevitable from the very first contact. It developed, gradually, out of a mismatch between how differently each race approached growth, territory, and time itself. Humans, short-lived and rapidly reproducing, treated expansion as urgent. Elves, accustomed to thinking in centuries rather than decades, watched that urgency erode a dominance they'd assumed was permanent, and the resentment that grew from that mismatch would go on to shape every major conflict between the two peoples for the next 1,500 years. Part 20. The first human kingdoms begin to form. Scattered settlements don't become kingdoms on their own, and the process by which humanity's earliest communities consolidated into organized political states took generations of gradual change, rather than any single defining moment. What started as isolated villages, focused entirely on immediate survival, slowly began forming looser networks, groups of settlements that shared resources, coordinated defense against monster incursions, and eventually recognized the practical benefits of a shared leadership structure rather than each community fending entirely for itself. The emergence of rulers followed a pattern that's less romantic than later legend would suggest. Leadership in this period tended to consolidate around whoever proved most effective at solving the immediate and constant problems facing these communities, organizing defense, securing farmland, negotiating or fighting with neighboring settlements, and the elder races whose territory kept overlapping with human expansion. Authority, in other words, was earned through practical results rather than inherited through any established tradition, since there was no established tradition yet for it to draw from. What accelerated this consolidation more than anything else was humanity's sheer rate of population growth. Communities that might have remained small and isolated for generations instead found themselves swelling rapidly, creating both the manpower needed to defend larger territories and the practical necessity of more formal organization to manage the resulting complexity. A dozen scattered villages could survive independently. A few hundred settlements sharing overlapping farmland and facing coordinated monster threats needed something closer to unified leadership to function at all. This period also marks the beginning of humanity's eventual dominance over the continent's political landscape, though nobody living through it would have recognized the scale of what was starting. The earliest kingdoms were modest by any later standard, small territories with limited reach, constantly vulnerable to both monster attack and conflict with elder races who hadn't yet accepted that human settlement was a permanent feature of the world, rather than a temporary intrusion that time would eventually reverse. Within a relatively short span, historically speaking, these early proto-kingdoms began to resemble something closer to the northern kingdoms that Geralt would eventually know. Borders remained fluid, rulers rose and fell with far less ceremony than later history would suggest, but the fundamental shift had already happened. Humanity had stopped being a scattered population struggling to survive, and had become, however roughly, a political force with territory to defend and ambitions of its own, and the continent's future would be shaped by that shift more than by almost anything else that happened in this era. Part 21. Learning to control chaos. Magic in the earliest years after the conjunction was less a discipline than a series of dangerous accidents. Chaos had entered the world with the collision of the spheres, saturating the continent in a force that certain individuals, both human and elven, found themselves able to draw on. But understanding of how to use that force safely or effectively was almost non-existent. The earliest practitioners were working entirely without precedent, discovering the rules of chaos through trial and error in a way that cost many of them dearly. Elves held a considerable advantage in this early period, given their older and more intuitive relationship to magic that predated chaos's arrival entirely. Even so, chaos itself was new to them as well, a force distinct from whatever older magic they'd practiced before the conjunction, and elven mages had to adapt their existing understanding to accommodate a kind of power that behaved according to different and less familiar principles. This adaptation gave them a head start over humans, but not an unlimited one. Humans, arriving with no prior magical tradition of their own, approached chaos with a bluntness that the more established elves generally lacked. Early human spellcasting, by most accounts, was unstructured and often reckless, driven by immediate need rather than careful study. This lack of refinement carried real danger. Chaos, used carelessly, could and did harm the people attempting to wield it. And the earliest generations of human mages paid for their inexperience, in ways that more cautious practice might have avoided. What eventually emerged from this chaotic beginning, appropriately enough, was a slowly forming body of practical knowledge. Techniques that worked passed down and refined. Techniques that failed abandoned or modified. This wasn't yet anything resembling formal magical education. It was closer to an oral tradition, individual mages teaching individual students, with no overarching institution yet in place to standardize what was being taught, or to prevent the same costly mistakes from being repeated generation after generation. The significance of this early period is easy to underestimate, because it lacks the organized drama of the Brotherhood of Sorcerers that would eventually emerge from it. But every later magical institution on the continent, every trained sorceress, every court mage advising a king, traces its lineage back to this uncertain and dangerous beginning, when chaos was still new enough that using it at all required a willingness to risk consequences nobody fully understood yet. Part 22. The first mages. Out of the chaotic early period of magical experimentation, certain individuals began to distinguish themselves, not merely by their ability to draw on chaos, but by their willingness to study it methodically, rather than simply using it as the immediate situation demanded. These were the first mages, in the sense that Geralt's era would recognize the term. Practitioners whose relationship with magic went beyond instinct or desperation and into something closer to deliberate craft. What set these early figures apart was a combination of natural aptitude and a rare tolerance for the kind of sustained, dangerous experimentation that advancing magical knowledge required. Working with chaos safely wasn't something anyone could simply be taught in this period, because the accumulated knowledge needed to teach it safely didn't exist yet. The earliest mages were, in a very real sense, building that knowledge themselves, often at significant personal cost, discovering through direct and sometimes catastrophic experience what the human body and mind could withstand. Among both elves and humans, these gifted individuals began to develop reputations, some as respected figures whose knowledge made them valuable to the communities around them, others as dangerous and unpredictable, feared as much as they were relied upon. This dual reputation, magic as both a central resource and genuine threat, would follow mages throughout the rest of the continent's history. And its roots trace directly back to this earliest generation of practitioners, whose successes and failures were equally visible to the people watching them work. The techniques these first mages developed, however crude by later standards, laid the groundwork for everything that would eventually become formalized magical education. Concepts around channeling chaos safely, managing its physical toll on the caster, and directing it towards specific and controlled effects, all trace their origins to this period of largely unsupervised trial and error. Without this foundation, however imperfect, the more structured magical institutions of later centuries would have had nothing to build upon. What this period ultimately represents is the transition from magic as raw and dangerous accident to magic as a discipline capable of being studied, refined, and eventually taught with some degree of consistency. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers, still centuries away at this point, owes its entire existence to these first mages, who took a force that had arrived through catastrophe and began, slowly and at real cost to themselves, the long process of turning it into something a person could actually learn to control. Part 23. Monsters become humanity's greatest threat. As human settlements expanded and consolidated into the earliest kingdoms, the monster problem that had shadowed humanity since its first arrival on the continent only grew more acute. Larger populations meant larger and more visible targets. Expanding farmland and settlement meant pushing further into territory monsters had already claimed as their own, provoking exactly the kind of conflict that smaller, more cautious settlements had generally managed to avoid through sheer inconspicuousness. Ordinary soldiers, for all the discipline and courage the earliest human armies could muster, were poorly equipped to deal with the specific threats monsters posed. Conventional warfare assumes an opponent that can be reasoned with, worn down, or negotiated into retreat. Most monsters offered none of that. They didn't fight for territory or resources in a way that allowed for treaties or truces. They fought or hunted according to instincts that had evolved in entirely different worlds, and a soldier trained to face other soldiers often found himself catastrophically unprepared for what actually waited in the dark. This mismatch became especially clear whenever human expansion pushed into regions that had gone effectively unclaimed by anyone since the earliest years after the conjunction. Forests and wetlands where monster populations had grown unchecked for generations. Settlements built too close to this kind of territory paid for it repeatedly, sometimes losing entire communities to creatures that ordinary defensive measures simply couldn't stop. Word of these disasters spread quickly, and fear of the wilderness beyond settled land became a defining feature of how humans understood the continent they were trying to claim. Priests and folk healers, who in many communities served as the closest thing available to organize protection against supernatural threats, proved similarly limited. Whatever spiritual authority they carried did little against a creature that simply wanted to feed. Mercenaries and professional hunters occasionally found success against specific and weaker monsters, but the more dangerous species required a level of specialized knowledge and physical capability that these early hunters, for all their courage, generally lacked. By the time the earliest kingdoms had solidified enough to think seriously about long-term expansion, monsters had become the single most consistent obstacle standing between humanity and control of the continent. Every existing solution, soldiers, priests, hunters, mercenaries, had proven capable of managing isolated incidents, but incapable of solving the problem at any meaningful scale. It was this accumulating and unresolved failure that would eventually push desperate rulers toward far more radical solutions. Part 24. A world that needed monster hunters. By the time several generations of human kingdoms had risen and struggled against the continent's monster population, a pattern had become impossible to ignore. Every conventional method of defense, no matter how well organized or well funded, eventually ran into the same limitation. Soldiers could hold a line against other soldiers, but a creature built to move silently through undergrowth or strike from beneath the water didn't fight on terms conventional warfare had ever accounted for. The frustration this produced among the rulers of the earliest kingdoms was considerable, and understandably so. Resources poured into defending against monster attacks yielded diminishing returns. Entire regiments could be lost to a single well-established creature without meaningfully reducing the broader threat, because killing one predator did nothing to address the dozens of others already established across contested territory. Rulers needed something that worked differently, and nothing available to them did. Mages offered a partial answer, and some of the more capable practitioners of this era did find ways to use chaos against specific monster threats with real success. But magic capable of dealing with dangerous creatures was rare, expensive to access, and generally concentrated among individuals with far more valuable uses for their time than traveling from settlement to settlement hunting down isolated threats. A kingdom couldn't build its entire defense strategy around the goodwill of a handful of powerful and independently minded mages. What began to circulate among the rulers and scholars most invested in solving this problem was the idea of something entirely new, warriors deliberately created, rather than simply trained, to match monsters on something closer to equal terms. Ordinary human bodies, however well drilled, lacked the reflexes, senses, and resilience that the most dangerous creatures possessed naturally. If monsters couldn't be fought with conventional strength, the reasoning went, perhaps the solution was to create something that wasn't conventional at all. This idea, radical and ethically troubling even by the standards of a desperate age, didn't emerge fully formed. It developed slowly, out of genuine necessity, as kingdom after kingdom exhausted every safer option available to them. By the time it reached the ears of certain ambitious and controversial mages willing to pursue it seriously, the demand for a permanent solution to the monster problem had grown severe enough that even the most dangerous experimental path started to look, to the people funding it, like the only option left. Part 25. The beginning of the Witcher Age. Everything covered across this section. The chaos of the earliest post-conjunction generations. The slow spread of monsters into every corner of the continent. The rise of the first human kingdoms. The earliest and unsteady steps toward controlling chaos. And the mounting and unresolved threat that ordinary soldiers and mages alike had failed to contain was building toward a single outcome. None of it happened in isolation, and none of it was separate from what came next. Every thread converges on the same point. Human expansion had created kingdoms with the population and resources to fund serious, sustained research, but those same kingdoms remained desperately vulnerable to a monster population that conventional forces couldn't handle. Magic had developed far enough to produce genuinely capable mages, but not far enough, or in sufficient numbers, to offer a scalable solution to a threat spread across an entire continent. Every existing tool available to the northern kingdoms had been tried, and every existing tool had proven insufficient on its own. It's in this exact gap, between what desperate rulers needed and what conventional solutions could provide, that the earliest experiments into Witcher mutations would eventually take root. The idea of deliberately reshaping the human body to match a monster's capabilities wasn't the product of idle scientific curiosity. It emerged directly from this accumulated pressure. Generations of failed conventional defense pushing towards something more extreme, because nothing more moderate had managed to work. The specific mages who would carry out this work, and the process that would eventually become known as the Trial of the Grasses, belonged to the next stage of this history, rather than this one. What matters here is the context that made their eventual work not just possible, but, from the perspective of the rulers who funded it, necessary, without centuries of monster devastation, without kingdoms desperate enough to consider radical solutions, without a magical tradition developed enough to attempt genetic experimentation at all. The Witchers as Geralt's era knows them simply wouldn't exist. This is the shape of the continent, as it stood on the edge of that next stage. Kingdoms rising, but vulnerable. Monsters entrenched and unchecked. Magic capable, but limited. Every consequence of the conjunction had been building, generation after generation, toward exactly this moment of desperation. And it was out of that desperation, rather than any single deliberate vision, that the first Witchers would eventually be made. Part 26. Why Witchers became necessary. By the time the idea of deliberately created monster hunters started gaining serious traction among the northern kingdoms, every conventional alternative had already been tried, and had already failed to solve the underlying problem. Knights, for all their training and equipment, were built for warfare against other armed humans, not against creatures whose strength, speed, or venom exceeded what steel armor and formal swordsmanship could reliably counter. A knight could win a single fight against a single monster and still lose the war against an entire ecosystem of them. Mercenaries offered flexibility that formal knighthood lacked, willing to take on the kind of dangerous, irregular work that most trained soldiers avoided. But mercenary bands worked for pay, not loyalty, and the most experienced monster hunters among them tended to specialize narrowly, effective against the specific threats they'd learned to handle, and often just as vulnerable as anyone else when faced with something outside that narrow expertise. There was no consistency to rely on. No guarantee that the mercenary a desperate village could afford would actually be capable of solving its problem. Priests, meanwhile, carried authority that meant a great deal within their own communities, but very little against a creature that had no relationship to the faiths humans practiced. Whatever comfort religious ritual offered a frightened population, it did nothing to stop a drowner from pulling someone under the water, and rulers who relied too heavily on spiritual solutions to a physical problem tended to watch their populations suffer for it. Faith could manage fear. It couldn't manage monsters. Mages represented the most genuinely capable option available, and some of the era's most skilled practitioners did real work protecting specific settlements or hunting down specific threats. But mages were rare, valuable, and generally unwilling to spend their careers traveling the countryside dealing with problems that offered little glory and considerable risk. A kingdom might retain a court mage for its capital. It couldn't realistically staff every threatened village with one, and the monster problem was, by this point, spread across the entire continent, rather than concentrated in any single region. What all of these failures pointed toward, cumulatively, was the need for something built specifically for this purpose. A warrior who combined a soldier's discipline, a mercenary's willingness to face genuine danger, and something closer to a mage's enhanced capability, all without requiring the rare and expensive training a full sorcerer needed. That gap between what existed and what the situation demanded is exactly where the earliest and most radical experiments into human mutation would eventually begin. Part 27. The Rise of Alcer. Among the mages whose names survive from this desperate and experimental period, few carry the weight that Alcer's does. He emerges in the lore as one of the most capable and most controversial sorcerers of his era, a figure whose reputation was built on genuine skill and permanently complicated by the ethics of how he chose to apply it. Several of his spells, Alcer's shield among them, remained in use by mages for centuries after his death, a testament to real and lasting magical achievement. What made Alcer distinct from many of his contemporaries wasn't just talent, but a particular willingness to pursue lines of research that more cautious mages avoided. His interest in mutation and genetic modification pushed well beyond the boundaries most sorcerers of his time were comfortable exploring, and the games are honest about the fact that this willingness produced both genuine breakthroughs and genuine horrors in roughly equal measure. Alcer didn't just refine spellcraft, he experimented on living beings, and some of what he created escaped his control entirely. His reputation as a creator of monsters runs alongside his reputation as the mind behind the witches, and the two are more connected than they might first appear. The same appetite for radical experimentation that eventually produced viable witcher mutations also produced creatures that caused real damage to the people and places around him. Alcer's own death, according to the lore, came at the hands of one of his own creations, a massive centipede-like beast summoned through his double-cross spell that proved impossible to control and ultimately killed him in the city of Maribor. This detail matters because it captures something essential about Alcer as a figure. He wasn't a careful, methodical scientist working within safe boundaries. He was someone whose genius consistently outpaced his caution, and the witches exist, in large part, because that same recklessness eventually found a target worth aiming at. Where lesser mages might have hesitated at the ethical weight of experimenting on children to fight monsters, Alcer, according to what the lore suggests, saw a problem the continent desperately needed solved and pursued the solution with a single-mindedness that history remembers as both essential and deeply troubling. Whether Alcer deserves to be remembered primarily as humanity's savior, or as one more example of magic's willingness to treat living beings as raw material, is a question the games leave open rather than answered. What's not in question is his central role in this history. Without Alcer's specific combination of skill, ambition, and moral flexibility, the process that eventually created the first witches may never have been developed at all. Part 28. Cosimo Malaspina and the birth of mutation research. Before Alcer ever began his own experiments, he learned his craft under a mage whose name carries almost as much weight in this history, even if it's less widely remembered. Cosimo Malaspina is credited, according to the lore surrounding this period, as a master of hybridization, mutation, and what the games describe in terms close to genetic modification, working with these ideas well before his most famous student would carry them to their eventual conclusion. What Malaspina represented was the first serious, sustained attempt to treat mutation not as an isolated magical trick, but as a field of study in its own right, worth pursuing systematically rather than stumbling into through accident. This distinction matters because it separates his work from the general chaos of early post-conjunction spellcasting covered earlier in this history. Malaspina wasn't simply using chaos as the situation demanded. He was trying to understand, deliberately, what could be done to a living body through magical intervention, and how far those changes could be pushed. Ortolan, the elderly and influential mage whose accounts provide much of what's known about this period, credits Malaspina and his student together as the true creators of the Witcher sect, with the specific framing that Malaspina's mentorship laid the groundwork that Alzur would eventually build the finished process upon. This suggests a relationship less like a single inventor working alone, and more like a tradition passed down, refined, and ultimately completed across at least 2 generations of dangerous and dedicated research. The ethical questions surrounding this research were significant even by the standards of an era that had already normalized a great deal of magical risk-taking. Working toward controlled mutation of a human body meant, inevitably, working with subjects. And the law doesn't shy away from the implication that this early research came at a real and often fatal cost to the people involved in it. Malaspina's legacy isn't remembered as purely admirable. It's remembered as foundational, in the same complicated way that much of the Witcher origin story resists easy moral framing. What Malaspina ultimately provided wasn't a finished process. It was a foundation, a body of dangerous and hard-won knowledge about what magical mutation could theoretically achieve, that his student would eventually take considerably further. Without this earlier groundwork, the specific breakthrough that produced viable witches may not have been possible at all, and Malaspina's role, quieter and less dramatic than Alzur's, remains just as essential to how this history actually unfolded. Part 29. The first mutation experiments, the earliest attempts to artificially enhance human capability through magic, didn't arrive at anything resembling a working witcher on the first attempt, or the 10th. What the law describes instead is a long, costly, and often devastating process of trial and error, refined gradually by Alzur, working alongside Malaspina, and eventually a third collaborator, a mage named Idaran of Ulivo, whose contributions to the final process are acknowledged even if they're less prominently remembered than Alzur's. Early subjects, drawn largely from unwanted or vulnerable children given the ethical realities this research operated under, were exposed to alchemical and magical treatments intended to reshape their bodies toward greater resilience, sharper senses, and faster reflexes. Most of these attempts failed, and failure in this context meant death or permanent and severe harm, rather than simply an experiment that produced no useful result. The survival rate throughout this developmental period was, by any reasonable standard, catastrophic. What kept the research moving forward despite this cost was the scale of the problem it was meant to solve. The monster crisis facing the Northern Kingdoms was severe enough that even mages funding and conducting this work seemed to treat the losses as an acceptable price for eventually producing something that could genuinely turn the tide. This calculation, treating a significant number of child deaths as a justifiable cost of research, is one of the more uncomfortable threads running through the entire Witcher origin story, and the games don't attempt to soften it. Gradually, through repeated and often brutal iteration, certain combinations of mutagens began producing survivors, and among those survivors, certain individuals began displaying the enhanced capabilities the entire project had been aiming toward all along. Faster reflexes, heightened senses, a resilience to injury and disease that ordinary humans simply didn't possess. These early successes were rare and hard-won, but they were proof that the underlying theory, however costly to confirm, actually worked. This period represents the genuine turning point in the history of witches, the transition from theoretical possibility to demonstrated fact. It didn't happen quickly, and it didn't happen without significant loss of life among the children subjected to it. But by the end of this stretch of experimentation, Alzur and his collaborators had something they hadn't had before: confirmation that a human body, pushed through the right combination of alchemical and magical intervention, could be transformed into something capable of matching the monsters it was meant to fight. Part 30. The First Witches. Once Alza and his collaborators had confirmed that survivable mutation was possible, the process moved from isolated experimentation towards something closer to organized production, and the individuals who emerged from this refined process became, in every meaningful sense, the first witches the continent had ever seen. According to the lore surrounding this period, an early large-scale attempt at Risberg Castle produced a batch of subjects numbering in the dozens, of whom only a handful of boys survived the mutations at all. What separated these survivors from the failed attempts that preceded them, and from ordinary humans generally, wasn't simply that they'd lived through the process. It was the specific set of capabilities that process had granted them. Reflexes considerably faster than an untrained human could achieve through practice alone. Senses sharpened well beyond normal human range. A resistance to poison, disease, and physical trauma that let them survive encounters an ordinary soldier wouldn't walk away from. These weren't incremental improvements. They represented a genuinely new category of person. The reaction to this first successful batch was, notably, not universal enthusiasm. The lore indicates that despite producing viable witches, this initial project lost its funding, in part because the surviving subjects showed limited aptitude for the magical dimension of the work their creators had hoped to instill alongside the physical mutations. Whatever vision Alzur and his collaborators had for these first witches, it wasn't fully realized on the first successful attempt, and the group that had initially backed the research withdrew its support. Rather than abandoning the project, Alzur, Cosimo, and Idaran relocated with their surviving subjects to Morgrave Castle, where they continued refining both the mutation process and the training regimen surrounding it, eventually establishing what would become known as the Order of Witches. This relocation matters because it marks the shift from isolated experimentation towards something closer to an institution, a place where the process could be taught, repeated, and passed forward, rather than remaining locked inside the knowledge of its original creators. What these first witches represented, more than any single ability they possessed, was proof of concept made permanent. The continent finally had warriors specifically built to counter what conventional soldiers, mercenaries, priests, and even most mages had failed to handle. They weren't perfect, and the process that created them remained dangerous and ethically fraught. But they existed, and their existence would go on to define an entire profession that outlasted every one of the mages who created them. Part 31. The Trial of the Grasses. The process that transformed an ordinary child into a witcher eventually became known across the continent as the Trial of the Grasses, and by the time Geralt underwent it centuries later, it had been refined considerably from whatever crude and often fatal early version Alcer and his collaborators first developed. Even so, the fundamental danger at its core never disappeared. This was never a safe procedure. It was a controlled and deliberate act of near destruction, aimed at rebuilding the body into something that could survive what came after. The trial itself involved subjecting a child, typically taken young enough that the body could still adapt to extreme physical change, to a sequence of alchemical mutagens designed to reshape the nervous system, the senses, and the body's underlying resilience. What exactly this process entailed in precise detail is something the law treats with a degree of restraint, focusing more on its consequences than a clinical account of every stage involved. What it establishes clearly is the outcome. A body pushed past ordinary human limits, and the cost, which was almost never survived without permanent transformation. Survival rates throughout the trial's history remained grim by any standard. Even in its more refined later form, a significant portion of the children subjected to it didn't survive the process at all, and those who did survive often carried physical marks of the mutation. Most visibly the shift in eye color, and, in rarer cases like Geralt's own, changes as dramatic as his white hair. This wasn't a treatment that could be undone or moderated. Once begun, it either produced a witcher, or it produced a body that couldn't withstand what had been done to it. Why the survival rate remains so low, even after generations of refinement, comes down to the fundamental nature of what the trial was attempting. It wasn't training in the conventional sense. It was a deliberate reshaping of human biology, using alchemical and magical means that pushed the body toward the very edge of what it could endure, with no reliable way to predict in advance which children would make it through and which wouldn't. The witches' schools that eventually formed around this process treated these losses, uncomfortably, as an accepted and unavoidable cost of producing the warriors the continent needed. What the trial ultimately produced, in the children who survived it, was the foundation for everything else that defined a witch's life. The signs, the enhanced physical capability, the resistance to toxins that let witches use potions no ordinary human body could tolerate, all of it traced back to this single, brutal rite of passage. It became, over the centuries following Alzur's original breakthrough, the defining and unchangeable threshold that separated every future witcher from the ordinary humanity they'd been taken from. Part 32. Mutations beyond the trial. Surviving the trial of the grasses was, for most witches, only the first stage in a longer process of transformation, one that continued through additional treatments and training designed to complete what the initial mutations had started. The trial itself provided the foundational shift, the reshaping of the body's basic capabilities. But the full range of abilities associated with a fully trained witcher developed gradually afterward, through a combination of further alchemical treatment and years of physical conditioning. Heightened senses, sharpened well beyond what the trial alone accounted for, were developed through this additional process, giving witchers the capacity to track scent, detect movement, and see in low-light conditions that would leave an ordinary human effectively blind. This wasn't simply a side effect of surviving the initial mutation. It was cultivated deliberately, understood by the schools that trained witches as essential to the kind of hunting work their graduates would spend the rest of their lives doing. Reflexes and physical speed followed a similar trajectory, refined through both the lingering effects of the original mutagens and years of the kind of intensive physical training that Kaer Morhen and the other witcher schools became known for. A witcher's combat capability was never purely a matter of what the trial had granted them. It was the product of that foundation, combined with decades of discipline, the two reinforcing each other in a way that neither alone could have produced. Resistance to disease and extended longevity rounded out the most significant of these later developed traits, granting witches a resilience that let them survive injuries and illnesses that would kill an ordinary person, while also extending their lifespans considerably beyond a normal humans. This combination of traits is part of why witches became such effective and durable monster hunters over the course of long careers, able to accumulate decades of experience that a shorter-lived warrior simply wouldn't have time to gather. Taken together, these additional mutations and treatments completed what the trial of the grasses had begun, turning a child who'd barely survived the initial process into the fully realized version of a witcher that Geralt's era would come to know. It's worth remembering, though, that this final result represented the successful outcome, the version of the story that got told because the subject lived to tell it. For every witcher who emerged from this complete process with enhanced senses and decades of monster hunting ahead of him, there were considerably more children whose story ended somewhere in the middle of it. Part 33. Humanity's first professional monster hunters. Once the first generation of surviving witches had completed their training and begun taking on contracts, the continent encountered something it hadn't dealt with before. A form of protection that could be hired rather than depended on through luck, faith, or the rare goodwill of an available mage. This shift mattered enormously to the kingdoms and communities that had spent generations struggling against monsters, with no reliable solution available to them at all. Early reception to these first professional hunters was, by most accounts, cautiously positive, at least among the rulers and communities directly benefiting from their work. A witcher offered something no other option had: consistent, specialized capability against threats that had previously required either overwhelming force or simple avoidance. Contracts began forming around specific and pressing problems: a monster terrorizing a stretch of road, a creature that had claimed a particular forest as its territory. And witches proved able to resolve these problems with a reliability that soldiers and mercenaries generally hadn't matched. This reliability quickly spread the reputation of the earliest witches, well beyond wherever they'd first begun operating. Word traveled between settlements and eventually between kingdoms, and demand for their specific skills grew accordingly. What had started as a small and experimental group of survivors from Alzor's research began to look, within a generation or two, like the beginning of an actual profession, one with its own developing reputation, its own growing body of practical experience, and its own increasing demand across the continent. The organization of this early profession followed naturally from where it had originated. The Order of Witches, established at Morgrave Castle by Alzor and his collaborators, provided a structure for training new witches and coordinating the growing demand for their services. This institutional foundation is part of why the profession managed to outlast its original creators, developing into something that could continue producing and training witches even after Alzor, Cosimo, and Idaran had moved on from direct involvement. What this period represents is the moment witches stopped being an experimental answer to a specific crisis and became something closer to a permanent fixture of continental life. The monster problem that had plagued humanity since the earliest post-conjunction generations finally had a dedicated professional response, and the demand for that response, born out of genuine and desperate need, ensured that the profession would continue growing long after the immediate crisis that had first prompted its creation. Part 34. Fear of the very men who saved humanity. Even as witches proved themselves capable of solving problems that had plagued the continent for generations, the relationship between them and the ordinary people they protected never settled into simple gratitude. This complication emerged early and never fully resolved itself, running straight through to Geralt's own era, where he'd still be dealing with exactly this same tension centuries after the first witches had proven their worth. Part of what drove this suspicion was simple visibility. The mutations that gave witches their abilities also, in many cases, left visible marks, changes to the eyes most consistently, and in rarer cases more dramatic physical differences that set them apart from ordinary humans at a glance. In a continent that had already learned, through hard experience, to fear anything that looked unnatural, witches occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. They weren't monsters, but they also weren't quite fully human anymore, at least not in the eyes of the communities that hired them and then watched them ride away. Rumor and superstition filled the gaps in what ordinary people actually understood about the mutation process, and much of what circulated was considerably darker than the reality, however dark that reality already was. Stories about witches being soulless, or emotionally hollowed out by whatever had been done to them, spread widely enough to become a persistent cultural assumption, rather than an occasional and easily dismissed rumor. This perception did lasting damage to how witches were treated, regardless of how many contracts they successfully completed. The magic underlying the mutations added another layer of unease, since fear of magic itself remained widespread even as its practical benefits became increasingly undeniable. A witcher represented magic applied directly to the human body, a level of intimacy with chaos that many ordinary people found more unsettling than a mage casting a spell from a safe distance. This discomfort with what witches actually were, rather than simply what they did, meant that gratitude for their work rarely translated into genuine acceptance of them as people. What emerged from this tension was a pattern that would define the witcher profession for its entire history. Communities needed them desperately and treated them once the immediate crisis had passed, with a wariness bordering on outright hostility. This contradiction, essential and unwanted in equal measure, wasn't a later development that crept into the profession over time. It was present from the very beginning, baked into how the continent understood witches from the moment the first ones started taking contracts. Part 35. The Conjunction's greatest legacy. Everything traced across this section: Alzor's willingness to pursue radical experimentation, Cosimo Malaspina's earlier groundwork in mutation research, the brutal trial and error that eventually produced viable subjects, and the trial of the grasses that would go on to define an entire profession, connects back, ultimately, to the same root event that this whole history keeps returning to. Witches exist because monsters existed, and monsters existed because the conjunction of the spheres tore open the boundaries between worlds 15 centuries before Geralt ever underwent the same process himself. This connection is worth stating plainly, rather than leaving implicit, because it's easy, once the story reaches the level of individual mages and individual mutations. to lose sight of the larger chain of cause and effect that made any of it necessary in the first place. Elle didn't set out to create witches because it seemed like an interesting magical challenge. He pursued it because the continent was drowning in a monster crisis with no other adequate solution, and that crisis was itself a direct consequence of the catastrophe that had scattered creatures from other spheres across a world with no natural defenses against them. Every contract a witcher would eventually take, every village grateful for a monster's death and simultaneously uneasy about the man who'd killed it. Every school that formed around teaching the trial of the grasses exists as a downstream effect of the conjunction. Remove the conjunction from this history, and monsters never arrive on the continent in the numbers or the variety that made witches necessary. Remove that necessity, and Alzur's research, however brilliant or however troubling, never has a reason to be funded, pursued, or continued past its earliest and most costly failures. This is part of why witches occupy such a distinctive place within the broader story the conjunction set in motion. Unlike kingdoms or magical institutions, which developed gradually and could plausibly have taken a different shape under different circumstances, witches represent a direct and deliberate human response to a specific problem that the conjunction created. They are, in the most literal sense available in this history, a solution engineered specifically to counter one of the catastrophe's most dangerous consequences. What makes this legacy worth dwelling on, rather than treating as simply one more link in a long chain, is how completely it defines the shape of the world Geralt eventually inherits. By the time he's riding the roads of the Northern Kingdoms taking contracts of his own, the Witcher profession is centuries old. Its origins in Alsur's desperate and ethically troubled experimentation, largely forgotten by the ordinary people who still fear and rely on witches in equal measure. The conjunction created the monsters. It created, indirectly and at enormous cost, the men built to hunt them, and it left behind a relationship between those two things that the continent has never fully resolved. Part 36. Humanity expands across the continent, with witches now taking on the monster threats that had previously made large stretches of the continent effectively unusable. Human expansion accelerated in a way it simply hadn't been able to before. Roads that had once carried genuine risk of ambush by drowners or worse became passable with far greater regularity. Forests that had been ceded, in practice, to whatever creatures had claimed them generations earlier started seeing settlement push into their edges, protected by contracts and the growing availability of professional monster hunters. This shift in safety changed the calculation for kingdoms that had previously kept expansion cautious and defensive. Land that would have been considered too dangerous to farm or settle a few generations earlier suddenly looked viable, provided a community could afford to bring in a witcher when trouble arose. The economics of this were not equal across every settlement. Wealthier and more established communities could afford this kind of protection more consistently than smaller, poorer ones, and that disparity shaped which regions expanded fastest and which remained vulnerable considerably longer. The population growth that had already distinguished humanity from the slower breeding elder races only intensified as this expansion continued. More secure farmland meant more reliable food, and more reliable food meant communities could sustain larger populations than the constant precarity of the earlier post-conjunction centuries had allowed. This compounding effect, security enabling growth, and growth enabling further expansion, is a large part of why human territory on the continent grew so dramatically within a relatively short historical window. Elder races watching this expansion continue had increasingly little room to respond. Elves, in particular, already reduced from the dominant position they'd held for 1,000 years before humanity's arrival, found their remaining territory shrinking further as human settlements pushed into land that had previously gone uncontested, simply because nobody had been willing to risk living there. This ongoing displacement, rather than any single decisive conflict, is what gradually reduced the elves from the continent's rulers to an increasingly marginalized minority within it. By the end of this period of rapid expansion, the shape of the continent had changed dramatically from what it had been even a few centuries earlier. Human territory now stretched across regions that had once been considered too dangerous to claim, secured not through any single military victory, but through the slow, steady work of witches making the land livable one contract at a time. What emerged from this expansion wasn't yet the organized kingdoms Geralt would eventually know, but the territorial foundation those kingdoms would be built upon was now firmly in place. Part 37. The Northern Kingdoms take shape. As human territory expanded across the continent, the loose and often informal political arrangements of the earliest settlements gradually gave way to something more structured and more permanent. What had once been scattered proto-kingdoms, held together as much by necessity as by any formal governance, began solidifying into the distinct and individually recognizable realms that Geralt's era would come to know as the Northern Kingdoms, each developing its own identity, its own ruling structures, and its own particular relationship to the land it occupied. This process didn't happen uniformly. Different regions developed at different speeds, shaped by local geography, the specific challenges each area faced from monsters or elder race resistance, and the ambitions of whichever rulers happened to consolidate power in a given territory. Some kingdoms formed around defensible geographic features, rivers or mountain ranges that offered natural protection. Others formed around resource advantages, fertile farmland, or valuable trade routes that made a particular region worth organizing and defending more formally than its neighbors. What united this scattered process, despite its regional variation, was a shared trajectory. Each of these emerging kingdoms was building on the same foundation, land made viable through witcher contracts, populations swollen by the demographic advantages humanity held over the elder races, and an increasingly organized political structure capable of coordinating defense, trade, and expansion at a scale the earliest scattered settlements never could have managed. The individual identities of Temeria, Redania, Cadwen, and Aden, familiar from Geralt's own era, were forming out of exactly this kind of gradual, uneven consolidation. Centuries of this development produced something the earliest human arrivals on the continent would barely have recognized as descending from their own desperate and precarious beginnings. Formal courts, standing armies, established trade relationships between neighboring realms, and the beginnings of the complex diplomatic and often hostile relationships that would eventually define the political landscape Geralt navigates throughout his own story. None of this existed in any organized form during the earliest post-conjunction centuries. All of it grew, gradually and unevenly, out of the same expanding human population that had once arrived on the continent with nothing. By the time this formative period had run its course, the political map of the North had taken on a shape that, while it would continue shifting through war, marriage, and conquest for centuries afterward, was recognizably the foundation of the world Geralt would eventually inherit. The Northern Kingdoms as a concept, distinct realms sharing a broadly similar culture while remaining fiercely protective of their own sovereignty, had become the continent's dominant political reality, a direct outgrowth of the same expansion that witches had made possible generations earlier. Part 38. Nilfgaard rises in the south. While the northern kingdoms were taking shape through the gradual consolidation described in the previous account, a separate and eventually far more consequential power was developing south of the Amel Mountains. Nilfgaard's early history receives less detailed treatment across the games than the North's, but what is established makes clear that its rise followed a similarly gradual pattern of expansion and consolidation, shaped by the same underlying pressures that had driven human growth across the entire continent. What distinguished Nilfgaard's development from the start was scale and ambition. Where the northern kingdoms developed as a collection of separate, often rival realms, Nilfgaard consolidated more thoroughly under a single, increasingly centralized authority, building toward the kind of unified imperial structure that would eventually allow it to project power across an entire continent, rather than remaining confined to defending its own regional territory. This centralization gave Nilfgaard organizational advantages that the more fractured north, for all its individual strength, often struggled to match when the two eventually came into open conflict. The empire's expansion beyond its original territory followed a pattern that would become one of the defining features of continental politics. By Geralt's era, methodical conquest of neighboring lands, often followed by genuine integration of the conquered population, rather than simple subjugation. This approach, whatever its underlying motivations, allowed Nilfgaard to grow its available manpower and resources considerably faster than a purely extractive form of conquest would have managed, feeding directly into the Empire's continued expansion northward over the following centuries. By the time Nilfgaard's ambitions turned decisively toward the northern kingdoms, the Empire represented a genuinely different kind of political entity than anything the fractured northern realms had needed to contend with before. Where the North's various kingdoms had spent generations developing rivalries and grievances against each other, Nilfgaard arrived as a unified and considerably more organized threat, one whose growth over the preceding centuries had been building steadily, largely unnoticed by northern rulers more preoccupied with their own regional disputes. This asymmetry, a fractured north facing an increasingly unified southern empire, would go on to define the wars that dominate so much of the political backdrop Geralt moves through across all three games. But its roots reach back to this much earlier period of gradual and largely unremarked development south of the mountains, where Nilfgaard was quietly becoming the power that would eventually reshape the entire continent's political future. Part 39. The elder races begin to lose their world. As human kingdoms in both the north and south continued their steady expansion, the elder races found themselves in an increasingly untenable position, one that had been building gradually since humanity's first arrival, but was now accelerating in ways that left little room for the kind of coexistence that had, however uneasily, defined earlier centuries. Elven territory in particular contracted steadily as human settlements pushed into land the Seidhe had considered their own for 1,000 years before humans had ever set foot on the continent. This displacement wasn't primarily driven by deliberate conquest, at least not in its earliest stages. It happened through the accumulated weight of demographic pressure. Human populations growing at a rate the longer-lived and slower-breeding elves simply couldn't match, gradually claiming land through settlement and farming that had previously gone to the elves by default. What began as a demographic imbalance hardened, over generations, into something closer to systematic displacement. As human kingdoms increasingly treated elven territory as land available for the taking rather than land already claimed by another sovereign people, conflicts over this contested territory intensified as the imbalance grew more pronounced. Elven resistance, understandable given what was being lost, was met with human military force that, backed by growing populations and organized kingdoms, proved increasingly difficult for the elves to counter effectively. These weren't isolated skirmishes. They represented the beginning of a long, grinding decline that would eventually see the elder races pushed from rulers of the continent to a marginalized and often persecuted minority within kingdoms built on land that had once been entirely theirs. What makes this period particularly significant is how it set the pattern for elven and human relations that would persist all the way into Geralt's own era. The resentment on both sides that this gradual displacement generated didn't fade with time. It calcified into the kind of entrenched hostility that would eventually produce the Scoia'tael. Elven guerrillas fighting a war their people had effectively already lost, and the systematic persecution of non-humans that Geralt would encounter throughout cities like Novigrad centuries later. This is the beginning of a decline that the elder races never meaningfully reversed. Every subsequent century would see their territory, their political influence, and their population continue shrinking relative to humanity's expanding presence, and the roots of that long decline trace directly back to this period, when the demographic and territorial pressures of human growth first began outpacing anything the elder races had prepared for, or could effectively counter. Part 40. Magic reshaped society. As the continent's political landscape solidified into the northern kingdoms and the Nilfgaardian Empire, magic underwent its own parallel transformation, moving from the scattered and largely individual practice of the earliest post-conjunction mages towards something increasingly woven into the formal structures of the societies that had grown up around it. Courts began retaining mages not as occasional consultants, but as permanent fixtures of governance, advisors whose magical capability made them politically valuable in ways that extended well beyond simple spellcasting. This integration reshaped how magic itself was understood and practiced. Where the earliest mages had worked largely in isolation, developing techniques through individual trial and error, the growing demand from royal courts and the increasing wealth flowing toward capable practitioners created the conditions for something closer to formal education. knowledge that had once been closely guarded by individual mages began, gradually, to be systematized and taught more broadly, laying groundwork that would eventually produce the Brotherhood of Sorcerers as a formal institution. Medicine and warfare both felt the effects of this shift considerably. Magical healing, however limited compared to what later, more refined practice would achieve, offered capabilities that ordinary medicine of the era simply couldn't match, making skilled healers valuable well beyond the royal courts that could afford to retain them permanently. On the battlefield, mages capable of turning chaos toward destructive ends became genuine military assets, and kingdoms that could field capable combat mages held real advantages over rivals who couldn't. Education followed a similar pattern of gradual formalization, as the accumulated knowledge of generations of practitioners began to be organized into something resembling structured curricula, rather than the individual apprenticeships that had defined magic's earliest centuries. This shift mattered enormously for who could eventually access magical training, moving the profession slowly away from purely individual mentorship and toward institutions capable of training practitioners at a scale the earlier informal system never could have managed. By the end of this period, magic had become inseparable from how continental society actually functioned, present in royal courts, on battlefields, in the treatment of the sick, and increasingly in the political calculations of every kingdom, significant enough to retain skilled practitioners. This integration didn't happen because magic had become safer or better understood in any absolute sense. It happened because the kingdoms that had grown out of centuries of expansion had come to depend on it. And that dependence ensured magic's institutions would only continue growing more central to continental life from this point forward. Part 41. Monsters become part of everyday life. Even as witches made significant stretches of the continent considerably safer than they'd been in the earliest post-conjunction centuries, monsters never disappeared from continental life entirely, and by this stage of history they'd settled into something closer to a permanent and accepted feature of the world, rather than the existential crisis they'd once represented. This shift in how people related to the monster problem is worth examining closely, because it reflects a broader pattern in how the continent processed the conjunction's legacy more generally. Folklore played a significant role in this normalization, transforming what had once been raw and immediate terror into stories, warnings, and traditions passed down through generations. Children grew up hearing which roads to avoid after dark, which forests carried particular reputations, which signs indicated a nearby lair worth reporting to the local authorities. This kind of practical, folklore-encoded knowledge became a standard part of how ordinary people navigated a world that still contained real danger, even as that danger had become familiar enough to manage rather than simply flee from. Local traditions built up around specific and recurring threats, developing into the kind of regional customs that would have made little sense to the earliest and more precarious human settlements, who'd had neither the time nor the stability to develop such elaborate cultural responses to a threat that had, in their era, still felt existential rather than merely persistent. By this later period, communities had the luxury of turning survival knowledge into something closer to tradition, a sign of how much more secure daily life had become, even without monsters being fully eliminated. Professional monster hunting, meanwhile, had matured into an established feature of continental economic life. Witches, the order that had originally trained them, now expanded into distinct schools with their own specializations and philosophies, remained in demand. But the demand itself had shifted in character. Rather than desperate existential requests for help against an overwhelming crisis, contracts had become something closer to routine commerce. Communities paying for a specific and manageable service, rather than begging for salvation from an unstoppable threat. This normalization represents one of the more understated, but genuinely significant consequences of everything that had unfolded since the conjunction. The monster crisis that had once threatened to overwhelm humanity's earliest settlements had, through centuries of adaptation, witcher intervention, and cultural accommodation, become simply another feature of life on the continent. Dangerous, occasionally deadly, but no longer existential. This is the world Geralt would eventually be born into. One where monsters were feared and managed, rather than fought as an unresolved and open crisis. Part 42. The new balance of the world. By the end of the long centuries traced across this section, the continent had settled into something that, while far from peaceful in any absolute sense, represented a genuine and durable stabilization after the chaos that had followed the conjunction. Human kingdoms in the north had consolidated into recognizable, if still rival, political entities. Nilfgaard had grown into a unified southern power, whose ambitions were only beginning to turn seriously northward. Magic had become an institutional fixture, rather than a scattered and dangerous individual practice. Witches had transformed the monster crisis from an existential threat into a manageable, if persistent, feature of daily life. None of this stabilization came without genuine cost, and it's worth resisting any temptation to describe this new balance as fair or equitable. The elder races had paid the heaviest price for humanity's expansion, reduced from the continent's original masters to an increasingly marginalized population within kingdoms, built on land that had once been entirely their own. Witches, despite their essential role in making this stability possible, remained feared and distrusted by the very populations they protected. The balance that had formed wasn't harmony. It was an uneasy equilibrium, held together by necessity rather than genuine reconciliation between the parties involved. What this equilibrium did provide, though, was the foundation for everything Geralt's own story would eventually be built upon. The kingdoms he'd ride between, the witcher schools he'd train within, the magical institutions he'd interact with throughout his career. All of it depended on centuries of exactly this kind of gradual, uneven, and often unjust stabilization having already taken place. Without this long process of settling into a workable, if imperfect, balance, the continent Geralt inherits simply wouldn't exist in any recognizable form. This is also the point in the continent's history where the direct, immediate consequences of the conjunction begin to recede from living memory, replaced by institutions and traditions that had grown up in its aftermath, without most people any longer thinking consciously about the catastrophe that had made them necessary. Monsters were simply monsters. Magic was simply magic. Witches were simply witches. The cosmic accident that had produced all of it 1,500 years earlier had become, for most of the continent's inhabitants, distant history rather than lived experience. What remained, quietly building toward a return to relevance that nobody on the continent could have anticipated, was the other side of the conjunction's legacy. The fate of the ANL, stranded in their own world, and slowly developing the ambitions that would eventually bring the wild hunt riding back across the sky in pursuit of a girl not yet born. The continent had found its balance. The world the elves had left behind centuries earlier was still searching for its own, and that search would eventually bring both halves of this history crashing back together. Part 43. The NL after the conjunction. While the continent spent 15 centuries working through the long, uneven process covered across the previous sections, the NL were dealing with a legacy of the conjunction that looked almost nothing like what humans, elves, or monsters on the continent had experienced. Their world hadn't been invaded. It hadn't been flooded with monsters or reshaped by an influx of chaos in the way the continent had. What the conjunction did to the ANL was quieter, and in its own way just as permanent. It broke their ability to move freely between worlds. Before the catastrophe, as covered earlier in this history, the ANL had developed a genuine and reliable method of interdimensional travel, crossing between spheres with a deliberateness the rest of the universe didn't share. The conjunction didn't grant them this ability. It took it away, or at least severely damaged whatever mechanism had made it possible, leaving the ANL stranded in their own world in a way that felt to a civilization that had defined itself partly through its command of the space between realities. Like a genuine amputation, this loss shaped NL society profoundly in the centuries that followed. A people who had once treated other worlds as reachable, even if the reaching required skill and preparation, now found themselves confined, and that confinement bred a particular kind of resentment that never really faded. The continent, and the Seidhe who'd settled there generations before the split, existed as a reminder of what had been lost, a world their cousins had reached and claimed, while the ANL now sat locked out of the doorway they'd once used freely. Restoring that lost ability became, gradually, one of the defining ambitions of ANL civilization. Though it would take many generations before that ambition crystallized into anything resembling a coordinated effort. In the immediate aftermath, the priority was simply adaptation, learning to function as a world unto itself, rather than one node in a wider network of accessible spheres. But the underlying desire to reopen what the conjunction had closed never disappeared. And it would eventually shape everything from the Arnell's internal politics to their centuries-long pursuit of a bloodline that hadn't even been conceived yet. What makes this side of the conjunction's legacy worth tracing carefully is how different it is in character from everything the continent experienced. The continent's story after the conjunction is one of invasion and adaptation, a world absorbing what had been forced upon it. The Annel's story is one of loss and restoration, a world trying to reclaim something it had once possessed and had never fully stopped grieving. Both stories, centuries apart and worlds apart, would eventually converge on the same girl. Part 44. A civilization trapped between worlds. Confined to their own sphere by the conjunction's aftermath, the Ainel rebuilt their civilization around Tirnalia, the city that had already served as their capital before the catastrophe, and that remained the center of their political and cultural life for the many centuries that followed. What emerged from this period of forced isolation was a society that, by most accounts surviving into Geralt's era, grew more insular, more hierarchical, and considerably more comfortable with domination as an organizing principle than the Seidhe who'd settled among gnomes and dwarves on the continent. Politically, the Ainel operated under a monarchy, with Oberon Mursatak ruling for a substantial stretch of this period as the King of the Alders, a title that carried both genuine authority and the weight of a civilization increasingly focused on questions of legacy and restoration. The court that grew up around this kingship reflected a society with considerable magical sophistication and equally considerable internal politics, where scholars, sages, and military leaders all vied for influence over how the NL should respond to their confinement. Culturally, the NL maintained much of what had originally connected them to their Seidhe cousins, a shared reverence for magic, for longevity, for a sense of inherent superiority over shorter-lived races. But the isolation they'd endured since the conjunction sharpened these traits into something colder and more absolute than what had developed on the continent, where the Ain Seidhe had been forced, however reluctantly, to negotiate coexistence with gnomes, dwarves, and eventually humans. The NL had no such pressure. Their own world contained no other intelligent species to negotiate with, only the unicorns they remained locked in conflict against. Militarily, this period saw the NL develop the kind of organized, disciplined force that would eventually become known across the continent as the Wild Hunt, though that specific identity was still centuries away from forming. What existed instead was a warrior culture shaped by generations of conflict with the unicorns, and by a growing sense that the NL's confinement was a wrong that needed correcting, by force if no other method presented itself. Underlying all of this, political structure, cultural insularity, and military development alike, was the same unresolved wound the conjunction had left behind. The Ainel had built a genuine and sophisticated civilization within their own world, but it was a civilization that never stopped defining itself, at least in part, by what it had lost. That unresolved loss would eventually become the engine driving some of the most consequential decisions in the Ainel's entire history. Part 45. The Unicorn Wars. Among the oldest and most persistent conflicts in Ainel history is the long war fought against the unicorns native to the world they'd settled after splitting from the Ain Seed. This conflict predates the conjunction of the spheres considerably, and it's worth noting up front that much of what's understood about it comes from lore that sits closer to the books and broader supplementary material than to detailed confirmation within the three main games themselves, so it's treated here as established background rather than something the games walk through in depth. What sparked this conflict, according to the surviving accounts, was the unicorn's natural and inherited command over movement between dimensions, an ability the ANL recognized immediately as extraordinarily valuable, and that they themselves, even at the height of their own interdimensional mastery, had never possessed instinctively. The unicorns didn't need gateways or magical training to cross between spheres. It was simply part of what they were, and that innate ability made them, in the eyes of an increasingly ambitious Elle civilization, a resource worth acquiring, rather than a species worth respecting as equals. The war that followed stretched across what the lore describes as centuries, brutal and largely one-sided in its eventual outcome. The Elle, with their organization, their magic, and their willingness to pursue total victory, gradually wore down the unicorn population, and the conflict eventually ended in something closer to conquest than negotiated peace. This victory came at real cost, but it left the Elle in a dominant position within their own world, controlling territory the unicorns had once held freely. What makes this ancient conflict relevant to the wider history traced throughout this account is its connection to what came later. The Elle's pursuit of the unicorn's dimensional abilities reflects the exact same underlying drive that would eventually shape their pursuit of Seidhe many centuries afterward. A civilization convinced that the power to move freely between worlds was rightfully theirs to claim. Whether that power belonged to unicorns or to a human girl carrying an inherited elven bloodline, the methods differed considerably across the centuries, but the underlying logic remained remarkably consistent. This is one of the clearer threads connecting the Elle's ancient history to their much later role as the Wild Hunt. Long before Eridan ever rode after Seidhe, his people had already established a pattern, identifying whoever or whatever possessed the interdimensional ability they'd lost, and pursuing it with a single-mindedness that treated the target's own wishes as essentially irrelevant to the outcome. Part 46. The search for a way home, even after their victory over the unicorns secured them dominance within their own world. The Elle never stopped searching for a way to restore what the conjunction had originally taken from them. Reliable and unrestricted travel between spheres, rather than the world-native abilities they'd conquered from the unicorns, and could, at best, use imperfectly. Generation after generation of Elle rulers, mages, and scholars devoted themselves to this problem, and generation after generation, the results fell short of what their civilization actually wanted. What made this search so persistent, rather than something that eventually faded into resignation, was the memory of what had been lost. The Elle hadn't simply heard stories about interdimensional travel from some distant and half-legendary past. Within living cultural memory, at least at the civilization's collective level, this had been a real and practiced ability, and its loss felt correctable in a way that a purely mythical power might not have. If it had been possible once, the reasoning went, it should be possible to reclaim, provided the right method or the right individual could be found. Various approaches were pursued across these centuries, from purely magical research into the mechanics of dimensional travel to the continued, if diminished, use of whatever unicorn-derived ability they'd managed to extract from their earlier conquest. None of these approaches produced anything close to what the Elle had possessed before the conjunction. What they could achieve remained unstable, costly, and limited, a pale imitation of the freedom their ancestors had once taken for granted. This persistent and repeated failure is part of what eventually reinforced the growing belief among Elle scholars and rulers that the solution wasn't going to come from magical technique alone. It was going to require an individual, someone whose own nature made stable interdimensional travel possible in a way that pure study in spellcraft hadn't managed to replicate. This shift in thinking, from searching for a method to searching for a person, marks the beginning of a much longer and more consequential project, one that would eventually produce the Elder Blood and, centuries later, Seidhe herself. What this long and frustrated search represents, more than any single failed experiment, is the depth of the Elle's investment in reversing what the conjunction had done to them. This wasn't a passing interest pursued casually across a few generations. It was a civilizational priority sustained across centuries, and that sustained investment is exactly what would eventually lead the Elle toward the breeding program that produced Lara Doran, and through her, the bloodline that would consume the rest of this history. Part 47. The Elder Blood is born out of centuries of failed searching for a purely technical solution to their lost interdimensional ability. The ANL eventually turned toward a different and far more deliberate approach, a genetic program intended to breed an individual whose own inherited capability could open the pathways between worlds that magic and study alone hadn't managed to restore. This is the origin of what would eventually be known as the Elder Blood, a lineage engineered deliberately and over many generations, rather than something that emerged naturally within the elven people. The scholars and mages who guided this program, referred to across the lore as sages, worked from an understanding built on generations of accumulated observation, of which bloodlines carried the strongest latent potential for the abilities they were trying to cultivate. This wasn't a quick process, and it wasn't a simple one. It involved careful selection across generations, an approach that treated individual elves less as people making their own choices, and more as components in a long-term breeding project aimed at a specific and predetermined outcome. That outcome eventually produced Lara Doran Ape Shal, born to Oberon Mursatak and his queen, and widely regarded within ANL society as the culmination of everything this genetic program had been working toward. Lara possessed what the program had been seeking for generations, an activated and genuinely powerful expression of the inherited ability the ANL had spent centuries trying to cultivate. She represented, to the sages and rulers who'd overseen her lineage's careful construction, the closest thing to a finished result their long project had ever produced. What the NL intended for Lara reflected exactly what the entire program had been built around. She was meant to marry Avalak, himself a respected sage deeply invested in the project's success, and produce an heir whose elder blood would be strong enough to finally restore the interdimensional travel the conjunction had taken from her people generations before her birth. This plan, carefully constructed across generations of selective breeding, treated Lara's own future as something already decided before she'd had any say in it at all. What happened instead, as the next part of this history covers in detail, diverged from that plan entirely, and the consequences of that divergence would ripple forward for centuries, eventually reaching all the way to Ciri and the Wild Hunt's pursuit of her. But the Elder Blood itself, the gene that made all of it possible, exists because of exactly this deliberate, generations-spanning project, the Arnell's most sustained and most consequential attempt to reclaim what the conjunction of the spheres had cost them. Part 48. The Prophecy of Ithlinne. Running alongside the deliberate genetic engineering that produced the Elder Blood is a prophecy that shaped how both elves and humans understood what that bloodline might eventually mean, attributed to an elven diviner named Ithlinne, and treated, across the centuries following its utterance, as one of the continent's most consequential pieces of foretelling. Understanding what this prophecy actually says, as opposed to what later generations assumed or wanted it to say, matters considerably for making sense of everything that follows. At its core, Ithlinne's prophecy speaks of a coming catastrophe, an age of ice and darkness that would threaten to end the world, and identifies a child of the Elder Blood as somehow central to what happens when that catastrophe arrives. The precise nature of that role, whether the child would prevent the catastrophe, survive it, or simply be present when it occurred, is treated with considerably more ambiguity across the source material than most popular retellings tend to acknowledge, and it's worth being honest about that ambiguity, rather than presenting a single, tidy interpretation as settled fact. What later generations, both elven and human, did with this prophecy varied considerably depending on who was interpreting it and what they wanted it to justify. For the ANL, the prophecy reinforced the urgency of their genetic program, treating the Elder Blood not merely as a tool for restoring interdimensional travel, but as something genuinely tied to the survival of their entire people against a coming catastrophe. For various human factions who eventually learned of the prophecy's existence, it became a different kind of tool entirely, invoked to justify political ambitions that had little to do with its original meaning. This gap between the prophecy's actual content and how it was subsequently used is one of the more important threads running through the rest of this history. Ithlinne's words became, over the centuries, less a fixed and settled piece of knowledge and more a kind of contested text, interpreted and reinterpreted by whoever had reason to invoke it, whether that was NL, sages justifying their pursuit of Ciri, or human mages and rulers with their own reasons for wanting to control or eliminate the Elder Blood's carriers. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the prophecy's existence, regardless of its precise and still debated meaning, gave the entire history of the Elder Blood a weight it might not otherwise have carried. A genetic program pursued purely for practical reasons, restoring lost travel between worlds, is one kind of story. A genetic program pursued because ancient prophecy suggested the bloodline was tied to the fate of an entire people is something considerably more consequential. And it's this second framing, rightly or wrongly, that shaped how both the NL and, much later, the humans surrounding Seidhe would come to understand what she actually represented. Part 49. Eredin and the Red Riders. Among the military structures the Arnell developed during their long centuries of confinement and searching, none would prove more consequential than the force that eventually became known across the continent as the Wild Hunt. Its origins lie in what the lore refers to as the Red Riders, or Der Gruadri, a military unit originally tasked with defending Arnell territory and, over time, increasingly directed toward campaigns of conquest and pursuit across other worlds, that their partial and imperfect command of interdimensional travel allowed them to reach. Eredin Brach Glass rose through this military structure to become its commander, and his eventual position as King of the Wild Hunt reflects a transformation of both the Red Riders themselves and Eredin's own ambitions within Ainel society. Unlike Oberon, whose later reign is described as increasingly withdrawn and inward-looking, Eredin approached leadership of this military force with an aggression and personal involvement that made him, over time, arguably more influential in shaping the Red Riders' direction than the king he nominally served. Under Eredin's leadership, the Red Riders evolved from a primarily defensive force into something closer to an army of conquest, capable of crossing into other worlds and, when circumstances allowed, taking what they needed from those worlds by force. This included, notably, the practice of taking captives from other spheres, particularly humans, to serve as labor within the ANL's own world. A practice that fed directly into the fear and folklore that would eventually surround the Wild Hunt across the continent, where the red armored riders crossing the night sky became associated with plague, death, and disappearance. The spectral appearance that gave the Wild Hunt its folkloric reputation stemmed from the practical difficulty of maintaining full physical presence during interdimensional travel, a limitation the ANL had never fully solved even after centuries of pursuing a way to restore their lost mastery of movement between worlds. What the continent's frightened observers saw as ghostly riders heralding disaster was, in reality, Eredin's forces straining against the very limitation their entire civilization had been trying to overcome since the conjunction first stripped it from them. By the time Eredin's pursuit of Seidhe began in earnest, the Red Riders had already spent generations refining themselves into exactly the kind of disciplined, aggressive force capable of chasing a target across multiple worlds without losing momentum. What the continent would eventually come to fear as the Wild Hunt wasn't a sudden or new development. It was the culmination of centuries of military evolution, shaped from the very beginning by the same underlying wound that defined so much of NL history since the conjunction first closed the doors their ancestors had once moved through freely. Part 50. Avalak's lifelong mission. Few figures in this history carry as much complicated weight as Avalak, the NL sage whose connection to the Elder Blood bloodline began long before Seidhe was ever born, and continued shaping his actions well past the point where most other participants in this story had either died or moved on. Originally intended, as covered earlier, to marry Lara Doran and father the heir the NL's genetic program had been working toward for generations. Avalak instead watched that plan collapse when Lara chose the human mage Cregennan of Lod over the future the sages had arranged for her. That collapse didn't end Avalak's investment in the Elder Blood. If anything, it deepened and complicated it, transforming what had originally been a role assigned to him by his own civilization's ambitions into something that reads. Across the following centuries, as considerably more personal, he'd known Lara directly, watched what happened when the ANL's plans for her bloodline were disrupted by her own choices, and witnessed the tragedy that followed as she was hunted and eventually died, leaving behind a daughter who carried her elder blood into a human world that had no idea what it had inherited. When that same bloodline eventually produced Seidhe, generations later, Avallac'h positioned himself differently than Eridan's forces did. Where the Red Riders approached the Elder Blood as a resource to be captured and controlled, Avallac'h took on something closer to the role of mentor, offering Seidhe guidance and training rather than pursuit and extraction. Whether this approach reflected genuine care for her as an individual, or a more calculated understanding that a willing and trained Seidhe would ultimately prove more useful than a captured and resentful one, is a question the games leave deliberately open. This ambiguity is worth respecting rather than resolving artificially in either direction. Avallac'h's own age, and the centuries he'd spent entangled with this bloodline's tragedies, make it entirely plausible that the line between genuine affection and strategic calculation had blurred for him long before Seidhe ever entered the picture. In ways he himself might not have been able to fully untangle, he'd spent longer than any human lifespan waiting for and working toward this bloodline's fulfillment. And that kind of prolonged investment rarely stays purely selfless or purely calculated. It tends to become both at once. What's clear, regardless of how his motivations are ultimately read, is that Avallac'h represents the longest continuous thread connecting the Elder Blood's origin story to its eventual conclusion. He was present for Lara Dorren's life and death, and he remained present, centuries later, for Seidhe's own journey toward whatever role the prophecy of Ithlinne had once suggested she might play. Few figures in this entire history carry that kind of unbroken continuity, and it's part of what makes Avallac'h one of the most genuinely difficult characters to categorize as simply ally or antagonist in the whole of Seidhe's story. Part 51. Why Seidhe changed everything. Every carrier of the Elder Blood before her had represented, at best, a partial fulfillment of what generations of Elle sages had originally set out to breed. Lara Dorren herself had carried the gene in its most potent known form until Seidhe, and even her line's descendants across the centuries between Lara's death and Seidhe's birth had shown only fragments of the full ability the sages had originally been chasing. Cirilla, Fiona, Elle and Rhiannon broke that pattern entirely, and understanding why requires looking at what actually set her apart from every ancestor who'd come before her. Where earlier carriers of the Elder Blood had displayed abilities that required training, ritual, or deliberate activation to access at all, Seidhe's power manifested instinctively, often without her intending it, or even understanding what was happening. Her ability to move between locations, and eventually between worlds entirely, first appeared as an uncontrolled response to extreme danger or fear, rather than a skill she'd been taught to use. This instinctive quality mattered enormously to the Elle, because it suggested a purity of expression in the gene that no carrier since Lara had come close to matching. What made this especially significant was the timing. Seidhe's emergence coincided with a period when the NL's need had grown considerably more urgent than it had been during the centuries of patient, methodical breeding that had produced Lara. Whatever crisis their own world was facing, and the games framed this crisis around the encroaching threat later associated with the White Frost, meant that a carrier with genuinely reliable and instinctive command over interdimensional movement wasn't simply valuable anymore. She'd become, from the ANL's perspective, potentially essential to their civilization's survival. Seidhe's abilities extended beyond simple travel as well, touching on elements of prophecy and a connection to time itself that the games treat with deliberate restraint rather than full explanation. She could sense danger before it arrived, glimpse fragments of futures that hadn't happened yet, and move through the fabric, connecting different worlds in ways that even Avallac'h, for all his centuries of study, struggled to fully map or predict. This unpredictability made her simultaneously the most valuable and the most difficult to control asset the ANL had ever pursued. It's this combination, raw and instinctive power paired with genuine unpredictability, that explains why Seidhe became the single most important individual in the entire history traced across this account. She wasn't simply the next name on a long genealogical list stretching back to Lara Dorren. She was the outcome the ANL's centuries-long project had actually been aiming for, arriving at a moment when their need for that outcome had never been more urgent, and carrying an unpredictability that meant even her own pursuers could never be entirely certain what she'd do next. Part 52. The Wild Hunt's true objective. Stripped of the folklore that had grown up around them across 15 centuries of continental fear, the Wild Hunt's actual objective was considerably more specific and considerably more understandable than the stories of plague and death that ordinary people told each other when the sky turned the wrong colour. Eridan's riders weren't chasing Ciri out of malice for its own sake, and they weren't harbingers of some abstract apocalyptic force. They were pursuing the one individual whose elder blood might finally restore what the conjunction had taken from their people 1,500 years earlier. This distinction matters because it reframes the entire conflict that dominates so much of Witcher 3. Eridan wasn't a villain in the sense of pursuing destruction as an end in itself. He was the commander of a civilization that had spent centuries confined to a single world, watching that world's situation grow increasingly dire, and he'd concluded, not unreasonably given everything traced across this history, that Ciri represented his people's best and possibly last chance at reclaiming the freedom of movement they'd lost. The war he waged wasn't conquest for its own sake. It was, from his own perspective, survival. That framing doesn't excuse the methods the Wild Hunt used, and the games are careful not to present Eridan as simply misunderstood. The pursuit of Ciri involved genuine cruelty, the destruction of communities that happened to shelter her, and a willingness to treat her own consent as entirely irrelevant to what the ANL needed from her. Whatever legitimate crisis drove Eridan's civilization, the methods he employed in response to it were his own choice, and the games consistently frame his ambition as tangled up with genuine pride and a belief in entitlement that went well beyond simple desperation. Avalake's more measured approach, mentorship rather than pursuit, reflects an alternate response to the same underlying crisis, suggesting that the Ainel's need for Ciri didn't require the violence Eridan brought to it. This contrast matters, because it demonstrates that the Wild Hunt's brutality was a choice rather than an inevitable consequence of what their civilization actually needed. Two figures from the same people, facing the same crisis, arrived at fundamentally different conclusions about what pursuing Ciri should actually look like. What this means, ultimately, is that the Wild Hunt's true objective was never conquest of the continent, whatever the folklore surrounding them suggested. It was the restoration of a freedom lost 15 centuries earlier, pursued by a commander whose methods made that restoration indistinguishable. From the continent's perspective, from exactly the kind of apocalyptic threat the old stories had always warned about, the riders crossing the sky weren't death arriving ahead of schedule. They were a wounded civilization, still bleeding from a catastrophe most of the continent had long since forgotten, reaching for the one thing they believed could finally close that wound. Part 53, the world Geralt was born into. By the time Geralt of Rivia was handed over to the Witches of Kaer Morhen, every major thread traced across this history had already been woven into the fabric of the world he'd grow up inside, without ever fully realizing how deep those threads ran. The northern kingdoms he'd eventually ride between existed because of centuries of human expansion that only became possible once witches had made the land safe enough to settle. The witches themselves, and the mutations that would soon reshape his own body, existed because of Alsor's desperate and ethically fraught research generations earlier. The monsters he'd spent his career hunting existed because the conjunction had scattered them across a continent with no natural defenses against them. A catastrophe that had happened so long before his birth that most people around him treated monsters as simply a fact of the world, rather than the consequence of a specific historical event. Magic, the chaos that mages like Yennefer would eventually draw on, existed for the same reason, arriving through the same collision of spheres that had reshaped everything else about the world Geralt was born into. Even the racial tension that would define so much of his experience, the persecution of elves and other non-humans he'd witnessed throughout his life, traced directly back to the long, uneven displacement covered earlier in this history. Humanity's expansion gradually pushing the elder races from dominance into marginalization over the centuries following the conjunction. Geralt wouldn't have thought of this tension as connected to some ancient cosmic catastrophe. He'd have understood it simply as the world working the way it worked, elves resented and mistrusted, humans dominant and expanding, far from his own knowledge or immediate concern, in a world he hadn't yet encountered, The Elle were still nursing the same wound that had shaped their civilization since the Conjunction first stripped away their command of interdimensional travel. Eridan's rise within their military structure, the long search for a way to restore what had been lost, the careful genetic project that would eventually produce Seidhe, all of it was unfolding in parallel with Geralt's own childhood, training, and earliest years as a Witcher, entirely disconnected from his awareness until fate, in the form of a debt claimed under the law of surprise, would eventually bring these separate threads crashing together. This is the continent Geralt inherited without asking for it. A world built entirely out of the consequences of an event that had happened 1,500 years before his birth, still actively shaping every kingdom, every conflict, and every monster he'd encounter throughout his career. He didn't need to understand the Conjunction to live inside its consequences. Almost nobody on the continent did. But understanding it now, looking back across everything covered in this history, makes clear just how completely his entire life was built on foundations laid by a catastrophe he never witnessed and would spend his whole career unknowingly navigating the aftermath of. Part 54. The Conjunction during the Witcher saga. Following the novels chronologically, without retelling their full plot, the Conjunction's legacy surfaces again and again as the underlying logic behind decisions that might otherwise look disconnected from each other. Geralt's own path through the saga, his gradual and reluctant acceptance of his bond with Ciri, his complicated relationship with Yennefer, his repeated collisions with the political ambitions of kings and empires, all unfold against a backdrop shaped entirely by consequences the Conjunction had set in motion centuries earlier. Ciri's own journey through the novels traces the clearest through line back to this history. Her elder blood, the reason Nilfgaard, the Elle, and various human factions all want some measure of control over her, exists because of the genetic program the Elle pursued in response to their own confinement following the Conjunction. Every faction pursuing her across the saga, whatever their stated reasons, is ultimately responding to the same underlying reality, that she carries something rare enough and old enough to be worth fighting a war over. Nilfgaard's ambitions throughout the saga connect to this history in a different, more indirect way. Emhyr var Emreis's interest in Ciri, tangled up as it is with his own complicated personal history and his empire's political ambitions, still ultimately depends on her elder blood carrying the significance it does. Significance that traces back to a bloodline the Elle spent centuries carefully cultivating. Nilfgaard's political machinations lay a human ambition on top of a foundation the elves had built long before any Nilfgaardian emperor had reason to care about it. The actions of nearly every major faction across the saga, the Lodge of Sorceresses, the various royal courts, the Scoia'tael fighting their losing war for elven territory, can be traced back, with varying degrees of directness, to consequences the Conjunction set in motion. Some connections are immediate and obvious, like Ciri's bloodline. Others are more diffuse, like the elven guerrilla movements whose grievances stretch back through centuries of the displacement covered earlier in this history. What emerges from following the novels with this longer history in mind isn't a different story than the one Sapkowski told. It's the same story, viewed with the awareness that almost nothing happening across its pages exists in isolation from an event that occurred 1,500 years before any of these characters were born. The saga's tragedies and its resolutions alike unfold inside a world the Conjunction built, whether or not the characters living through it ever fully grasp how completely that's true. Part 55. The Conjunction's legacy in the Witcher games. Where the novels conclude, the games pick up a story that continues exploring the same underlying consequences, even as they diverge in specific plot details from what the books had established. Geralt's amnesia at the start of the first game strips him of memory, but not of the world he's still embedded within, a continent still shaped entirely by the same forces traced throughout this history: monsters, magic, kingdoms, and the lingering racial tensions that had never been resolved by the time the novels concluded. Ancient dimensional magic remains central throughout the trilogy, most explicitly in Witcher 3, where portals, the Elle's world, and the mechanics of interdimensional travel move from background lore into direct, playable content. The games let players walk through Ithlinne itself, encounter the Elle directly, rather than simply hearing about them through folklore, and witness firsthand the consequences of a civilization still chasing what the Conjunction had taken from their ancestors 15 centuries earlier. The Elder Blood, treated with considerable mystery throughout much of the novels, receives more direct exploration across the games, particularly through side content, and the additional context the developers built around series' abilities and their connection to the broader history of the Elle's genetic program. This expansion doesn't contradict what the books established. It builds on it, filling in details about the mechanics and history of the Elder Blood that the novels had largely left as background mystery. The Wild Hunt itself receives the most substantial expansion of any single thread carried over from the books into the games, where the novels treat Eredin and his riders with a degree of remove. The games make the Wild Hunt's pursuit of Ciri the central conflict of the entire third installment, giving players direct confrontation with Eredin, extended time in the NL's own world, and a considerably more detailed account of what the Red Riders actually wanted and why, building out a version of this conflict that goes well beyond what the source novels had room to fully explore. What ties the games back to the Conjunction, ultimately, is the same thing that ties the novels to it. Nothing in this continuation exists independently of the catastrophe that opened this entire history. The games simply had the scope and the additional decade of development between the novel's conclusion and the trilogy's release to explore that legacy in considerably more depth than the source material had originally provided, giving players direct access to consequences the books had largely kept at arm's length. Part 56. Can another conjunction happen? Throughout both the books and the games, there are scattered suggestions that the boundaries between worlds remain less stable than most of the continent's inhabitants would prefer to believe, and it's worth examining what evidence actually exists for this possibility, without inflating scattered hints into a confirmed and detailed prophecy. The lore treats this question with genuine ambiguity, and that ambiguity should be preserved rather than resolved through confident speculation. Portals themselves, unstable and dangerous even in Geralt's era, offer one piece of evidence that the barriers between worlds haven't fully healed since the original catastrophe. If dimensional travel were entirely impossible after the Conjunction sealed most of the pathways that had once existed, the existence of any portals at all, however dangerous and unreliable, suggests the separation between spheres remains imperfect rather than absolute. This imperfection is part of why figures like Avalak and the NL, more broadly, continued believing restoration was possible in the first place. The White Frost, whatever its precise nature across the differing versions the books and games present, is described in both continuities as connected to the fabric separating worlds, whether as an ice age moving toward the continent according to the novels, or as a more directly supernatural force consuming the NL's world according to the games. Either version implies that whatever stability exists between spheres remains fragile enough to be genuinely threatened, rather than permanently and irreversibly settled since the original Conjunction. Magical disturbances scattered throughout both the books and the games, unusual portal activity, unexplained crossings, creatures occasionally slipping through in ways that suggest the barriers aren't perfectly sealed, all point toward the same underlying suggestion, without ever confirming it outright. The universe the Conjunction created didn't return to the isolated, stable arrangement that had existed before the catastrophe. It settled into something considerably more precarious, held together well enough for ordinary life to continue, but never fully closed off from the possibility of further disruption. What can honestly be said is that neither the books nor the games commit to a clear answer about whether a second Conjunction level event is coming, or even possible in the same form the original took. What they offer instead is persistent, low-level evidence that the separation between worlds was never fully restored after the first catastrophe. Evidence substantial enough to keep figures like the NL believing further crossings might be achievable, without ever confirming, one way or another, whether the continent will ever face anything on the scale of what happened 1,500 years before Geralt's birth. Part 57. The White Frost and the Fate of the Worlds. Few elements of this entire history differ as significantly between the books and the games as the White Frost, an understanding that difference matters for anyone trying to hold both continuities in mind at once, rather than blending them into a single, inconsistent account. The novels present the White Frost as something closer to a natural, if magically accelerated, ice age. An inevitable cooling of the continent's climate that Ithlinne's prophecy connects to the fate of the elves, rather than to any single dramatic confrontation Seidhe might win or lose. In this book version, the White Frost isn't something that can be stopped through combat or a single climactic choice. It's an approaching and largely unavoidable process. And the prophecy surrounding it suggests that what Seidhe or her descendants might actually accomplish is not preventing the Ice Age itself, but opening a path for people to escape the continent before it fully arrives, echoing the same kind of interdimensional movement that the Elle had spent centuries trying to reclaim for entirely different reasons. The games take this same core concept and reshape it into something considerably more immediate and more directly tied to the Elle's own world. Rather than a slow climate shift approaching the continent over millennia, the White Frost in Witcher 3 appears as an active, consuming force already devastating the Elle's sphere, which is part of why Eredin's pursuit of Seidhe carries such urgency throughout the game. His people aren't preparing for a distant future threat. They're watching their own world die in real time, and Seidhe represents a potential means of escape or resolution that the book's more gradual version never quite offers with the same immediacy. This difference in framing changes what Seidhe's role actually means across the two continuities. In the books, she's connected to a prophecy about a slow ending that she might help certain people survive, but not something she can decisively defeat. In the games, she becomes an active participant capable of directly confronting, and in at least one possible ending, halting the White Frost outright. A far more conclusive resolution than the novel's more ambiguous and open-ended treatment of the same underlying threat. Both versions ultimately connect back to the same root, the fabric between worlds that the conjunction disrupted 1,500 years earlier, and the way the Elder Blood offers a potential answer to a crisis tied to that same disruption. But the specific shape of that crisis, gradual ice age or active consuming apocalypse, differs enough between the two continuities that they're best understood as related but genuinely distinct interpretations, rather than a single, unified account that the games simply illustrated more vividly than the source novels had. Part 58. The Conjunction's Last Living Legacy. Of everything the conjunction of the spheres set in motion across the 15 centuries traced throughout this history, the Elder Blood represents its most direct and most personal surviving connection. Kingdoms rose and fell. Witcher schools formed and, by Geralt's era, had mostly declined. Magic became institutionalized. But the Elder Blood remained a living thread, carried forward through generations of a single bloodline, connecting the immediate aftermath of the catastrophe all the way to Seidhe, standing at the center of Witcher 3's climactic events. This continuity matters because it's easy, across a history this long, to treat the conjunction as something that happened and then finished happening, a single event whose consequences gradually diffused into the general background of continental life. The Elder Blood resists that framing entirely. It's not a diffuse consequence. It's a specific, traceable inheritance, passed down through Lara Dorren to her descendants, eventually reaching Seidhe carrying essentially the same genetic potential that Elle's sages had spent generations of careful breeding trying to cultivate in the wake of their own loss. What makes this inheritance so significant is what it actually represents at its core. The Elder Blood isn't simply a magical gift passed through a bloodline. It's the closest thing the post-conjunction universe has to a working key for the exact same interdimensional freedom that the conjunction itself had both created and destroyed, granting brief and chaotic movement between worlds, while simultaneously stripping away the more stable and deliberate travel the Elle had once possessed before the catastrophe struck. Seidhe, carrying this inheritance more purely than any of her ancestors since Lara herself, exists as living proof that the conjunction's influence never actually ended. 1,500 years after the spheres collided, a girl born in Sintra to a lineage, stretching back through elven royalty to a genetic project born directly out of that ancient catastrophe, still carried its consequences in her own body, in abilities she hadn't asked for and often struggled to control. connecting her directly to an event that had occurred long before written history on the continent had any clear record of what had actually happened. This is why the Elder Blood deserves to be understood as more than simply a plot device driving the pursuit that dominates so much of series' story. It's the clearest possible demonstration that the conjunction was never truly finished happening. Its consequences didn't end with the immediate chaos of the first post-conjunction centuries. They continued, quietly, through a single traceable bloodline, all the way to a young woman who would eventually have to decide, largely on her own terms, what to do with an inheritance that predated her by 15 centuries and had cost countless lives across the generations that carried it forward to her. Part 59. Every major event caused by the conjunction, bringing together everything traced across this history. It's worth stepping back one more time to see the full chain laid out plainly, from its first link to its most recent. The conjunction of the spheres tore open the boundaries between countless separate worlds, and that single catastrophic event released chaos onto a continent that had never needed to account for it, displaced monsters into an ecosystem with no natural defenses against them, and stranded the first waves of humanity on land that had, until that moment, belonged entirely to gnomes, dwarves, and elves. From that initial displacement, every subsequent development follows in a traceable line. Monsters, unchecked by natural predators, spread across the continent and became the defining threat of the following centuries. A threat severe enough that desperate kingdoms eventually turned to Alza and his collaborators for a radical solution. That solution, the trial of the grasses, produced witches, and witches made lands safe enough for humanity's already rapid population growth to expand across the continent at a pace the elder races could never match. That expansion produced the northern kingdoms, and separately, the rise of Nilfgaard, two political structures whose eventual collision would define centuries of warfare stretching all the way into Geralt's own lifetime. The same expansion pushed the elder races into decline, displacing them from dominance into the marginalized and often persecuted position they occupy throughout Geralt's era. A decline whose roots traced directly back to the demographic pressures the conjunction had set loose 15 centuries earlier. Meanwhile, on the other side of the same catastrophe, the NL's loss of stable interdimensional travel drove their own long and separate history, the war against the unicorns, the search for a technical solution that never fully worked, and eventually the genetic program that produced the Elder Blood, Lara Doran, and centuries later, Ciri herself. The Wild Hunt, Eridan's Pursuit, the White Frost, and the final confrontation that closes out Witcher 3 are all, in the most direct sense possible, the last chapter of a story that the conjunction began. Laid out this way, the full chain becomes difficult to argue with. Every kingdom, every witcher, every mage, every monster, and every major conflict traced throughout this entire history connects back, through however many intermediate steps, to a single catastrophic collision of worlds that occurred 1,500 years before any of these events could unfold. The conjunction didn't simply set the stage for the Witcher saga. It built every piece of that stage, and everything that happened on it afterward was, in one way or another, still working through the consequences of that original collision. Part 60. Book canon versus game canon. Comparing Andrzej Sapkowski's novels against CD Projekt Red's games requires accepting, up front, that the two aren't a single unified continuity, however closely they overlap. The games are explicitly not canon to the books in a strict sense, developed as a continuation that respects the novel's spirit and major outcomes while diverging, sometimes significantly, in specific detail. Understanding where those divergences occur matters for anyone trying to hold both versions of this history in mind without confusing one for the other. The core narrative of the conjunction itself remains broadly consistent across both continuities. Both agree that isolated spheres collided roughly 1,500 years before Geralt's story, that monsters and chaos entered the continent as a result, and that humanity arrived stranded from its own destroyed world. This foundational agreement is part of why the games have generally been well regarded, even by readers deeply attached to the novels. Since the underlying cosmology hasn't been contradicted, only expanded, Where the two continuities diverge most noticeably is in scope and specificity. The novels, working within the format of prose fiction, often leave significant gaps in this history, mentioning the conjunction, the Elder Blood, and Ithlinne's Prophecy without providing the kind of detailed, explorable backstory that a video game's environmental storytelling and side content naturally accumulate. The games filled many of these gaps, sometimes drawing on supplementary material like the tabletop role-playing games and Gwent's card lore, expanding figures like Alsor and Cosimo Malaspina into considerably more developed characters than the brief references they receive in the source novels. The White Frost stands as the clearest example of genuine divergence rather than simple expansion, as covered in detail earlier in this history. The books present a slow, largely unstoppable ice age tied to prophecy about the elves' survival. The games present something more immediate and more directly tied to the NL's own dying world, giving Ciri agency to actively confront and, in certain endings, halt the crisis outright. This isn't a case of the games filling in a gap. It's a case of the games making a different creative choice about how this element of the mythology should function. What remains consistent across both continuities, despite these differences in scope and specific plot mechanics, is the underlying emotional and thematic weight the conjunction carries throughout the entire saga. Both versions treat it as the single event that made everything else possible: monsters, magic, witches, kingdoms, and the tragic weight of Ciri's inheritance. The games expanded the specifics considerably and occasionally reshaped them, but they never abandoned the foundational understanding the novels first established: that this one ancient catastrophe is the root every other story in the setting eventually grows from. Part 61. Mysteries that remain unanswered. For everything this history has traced across the preceding 60 parts, a considerable amount about the conjunction of the spheres remains genuinely unresolved, and it's worth closing this exploration of confirmed lore by being honest about exactly what neither the books nor the games have ever fully answered. The most fundamental of these unanswered questions is the conjunction's actual cause. Both continuities describe what happened, worlds colliding, boundaries failing, but neither commits to a definitive explanation of why it happened at the specific moment it did. The number of worlds actually involved remains similarly uncertain. The lore gestures toward dozens, possibly hundreds, of separate spheres affected by the catastrophe, but no confirmed and complete accounting exists anywhere in either the books or the games. Most of these worlds are never named, never described, and never revisited, leaving the true scale of the conjunction as something closer to implied vastness than confirmed detail. This is one of the areas where fan speculation has filled in the most, and where that speculation should be recognized clearly as speculation rather than treated as settled fact. What happened to the worlds that don't correspond to the continent or the ANL's own sphere is another significant gap. If dozens or hundreds of worlds were affected, the vast majority of them simply never appear again in either continuity, their fate left entirely to the imagination. Did some of them fare better than the continent, avoiding the kind of monster infestation that defined the post-conjunction centuries here? Did others fare considerably worse? The lore offers no answer, and any confident claim about these unseen worlds should be treated with real skepticism. The exact mechanics of how the boundaries between spheres worked, both before the conjunction and in whatever partial and unstable form survived afterward, also remain frustratingly vague. The NL clearly understood something about this mechanism before the catastrophe, given their pre-conjunction mastery of interdimensional travel, but neither continuity offers a detailed account of how that mastery actually functioned, what specifically the conjunction broke, or why some limited and dangerous form of crossing remained possible afterward, while the more stable and controlled version did not. What all of these unresolved questions suggest, taken together, is that the conjunction was always intended, by its original creator and by the developers who later expanded on his work, to function as much as mystery as history. The precise mechanics matter less than the consequences, and both the books and the games have consistently prioritized exploring what the conjunction did to the people living in its aftermath, over explaining, in exhaustive technical detail, exactly how or why it happened in the first place. That choice leaves real and permanent gaps in this account. And honesty about those gaps matters more than manufacturing false certainty to fill them. Part 62. Why the conjunction of the spheres is the most important event in Witcher history. Having traced this history from the quiet, isolated worlds that existed before any of it began, through the catastrophic collision itself, through the long centuries of adaptation that followed on the continent, through the creation of witches, the rise of kingdoms and empire, the parallel and separate suffering of the Elle, and finally through the elder blood and Ciri's own place at the center of everything that Legacy eventually produced, the case for the conjunction's centrality to this entire universe doesn't need much further argument. It's been demonstrated, piece by piece, across everything covered so far. Every race that appears throughout the Witcher saga exists in its current form because of decisions and consequences the conjunction set in motion. Humans arrived because their own world was destroyed in the collision. Elves lost their dominant position because of the demographic and territorial pressure that human arrival eventually created. Monsters exist on the continent at all because the catastrophe scattered them there from spheres where they'd evolved to belong. None of these races would look anything like they do in Geralt's era without this single shared point of origin running underneath all of them. Every institution that shapes the political and magical landscape of the games traces the same lineage. The northern kingdoms and Nilfgaard alike grew out of centuries of expansion that witches, themselves a direct product of the conjunction's monster crisis, had made possible in the first place. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers formed out of the slow institutionalization of chaos, a force that had no presence on the continent before the spheres collided. Even the Witcher schools, with their distinct philosophies and specializations, exist because Alzur's original desperate experiments eventually needed to be organized and passed forward, and every conflict that gives the saga its emotional and narrative weight. Geralt's struggle with neutrality in a world that refuses to let him stay uninvolved. Ciri's inherited burden as the carrier of a bloodline she never asked for. The tragedy of Lara Dorren and Cregennan of Lod. The long grinding war between elves and humans. The pursuit that drives Eredin and the wild hunt across multiple worlds in search of Ciri. All of it descends, through however many intermediate steps, from the same single catastrophic event. This is why the conjunction of the spheres deserves to be understood as more than background exposition, more than a piece of opening narration a player hears once and then moves past without further thought. It's the foundation everything else in this universe is built on top of. Without it, there is no continent, as Geralt would recognize it, no witches, no elder blood, no wild hunt, and no story worth telling at all. Every major race, every kingdom, every monster, every witcher, every magical tradition, and every prophecy that runs through the entirety of the Witcher saga originates, in the end, from the moment the spheres collided. And understanding that origin is understanding the whole of what makes this world what it is. Art 63. How the conjunction changed every living race. Looking back across this entire history with fresh eyes, rather than simply retracing the same narrative beats already covered, it's worth examining side by side exactly how differently each race experienced the conjunction's aftermath, because the differences are as revealing as the shared origin point itself. Humans experienced it as a rival without a home to return to, a species thrown into an unfamiliar world with nothing to fall back on except numbers, and a willingness to keep expanding, regardless of the cost that expansion demanded of everyone around them. The elder races experienced something closer to slow dispossession. Gnomes and dwarves, already established on the continent before the elves ever arrived, responded to the post-conjunction chaos by retreating further into isolation, protecting what they could rather than contesting territory the way the elves initially tried to. This retreat let them survive the following centuries in a more stable position, relatively speaking, than the Aen Seidhe, whose more open and expansive civilization had far more exposed territory to lose once humanity's expansion began in earnest. Elves suffered the most visible and dramatic reversal of fortune of any race touched by the conjunction's aftermath. A civilization that had ruled the continent for 1,000 years before humans ever arrived found itself, within a handful of centuries, reduced to a marginalized and frequently persecuted minority within kingdoms built on land that had once been entirely theirs. This reversal wasn't caused directly by the conjunction itself. It was caused by the demographic and territorial pressure that humanity's arrival, a direct product of the same catastrophe, eventually generated. Monsters experienced the conjunction's aftermath in purely ecological terms, an opportunity rather than a hardship, at least for the species that successfully adapted to their new and largely undefended environment, where every intelligent race touched by the conjunction had to grapple with loss, displacement, or the difficult work of rebuilding a society from nothing. Monsters simply found new territory to claim, unbothered by any of the political or emotional weight the catastrophe carried for everyone forced to actually reckon with what it meant. What ties all of these divergent experiences together is the same root cause explored throughout this entire history, but the specific shape each race's response took reveals just how unevenly a single catastrophic event can distribute its consequences. Some species adapted and thrived, others survived through retreat. At least one civilization, the elves, spent the following 15 centuries in a long, slow decline that the conjunction set in motion without ever directly causing on its own. Every living race on the continent still carries some version of this uneven inheritance, whether they recognize its origin or not. Part 64. Why monsters never disappeared. 15 centuries after the conjunction first scattered creatures from countless other spheres across a continent unprepared for them, monsters remain, in Geralt's era, a permanent and unresolved feature of continental life, rather than a threat that witches ever fully eliminated. Understanding why requires looking past the individual successes of any single contract and examining what actually happened at the level of entire populations over the long centuries between the initial invasion and the present day. The most straightforward explanation is successful adaptation. Many monster species that survived their initial displacement didn't merely endure in a hostile new environment. They established genuine breeding populations, finding within the continent's ecosystems enough available prey, territory, and shelter to sustain generations of offspring rather than a single surviving cohort slowly dying out. Once a species establishes breeding populations across multiple regions, eliminating it entirely becomes an almost impossible task, regardless of how many individual witches spend their careers hunting its members. Witches themselves, for all their effectiveness against individual threats, were never numerous enough to accomplish full eradication, even at the height of the profession's influence. A single witcher can clear a specific contract, kill a specific creature terrorizing a specific village, but the broader monster population across an entire continent's worth of forests, swamps, and mountains remained far beyond what any realistic number of trained hunters could hope to fully suppress. The profession managed the crisis. It never came close to solving it outright. Some species, additionally, proved remarkably resilient, specifically because they derived from spheres with harsher or more competitive conditions than anything the continent's own ecosystems had produced. A creature that had evolved to survive genuine interspecies competition in its original world often found the continent, even accounting for witches. A comparatively easy environment to establish itself within, since nothing native to this world had evolved defenses specifically calibrated to counter it. What all of this means, taken together, is that monsters never disappeared because there was never a realistic mechanism by which they could have. The conjunction didn't introduce a temporary problem that time and effort eventually solved. It permanently altered the continent's ecology, and 15 centuries later, that alteration remains as much a fact of the landscape as the rivers and mountains that predate the catastrophe entirely. Witches made the world survivable. They never made it, and were never going to make it, entirely safe. Part 65. The conjunction's influence on every kingdom. Consider the political map that Geralt would eventually navigate across all three games, and notice how completely every border, every rivalry, and every alliance depends on a chain of events that traces back, without exception, to the conjunction of the spheres. This isn't an exaggeration offered for dramatic effect. It's a straightforward observation about how thoroughly one catastrophic event shaped the specific political reality that would eventually exist 15 centuries later. Temeria, Redania, Cadwen, and the other northern kingdoms exist as distinct political entities because human settlement, made possible by witches clearing land that had previously been ceded to monsters, expanded far enough and grew organized enough to produce genuinely separate and competing states. Without the conjunction, there's no monster crisis. Without the monster crisis, there's no witcher profession. Without witches, human expansion never reaches the scale needed to produce kingdoms this large, this populous, or this politically developed. Nilfgaard's rise follows an identical logic, even though its specific historical development receives less detailed coverage than the North's across both the books and games. The Empire's growth depended on the same underlying conditions: humanity's rapid population growth outpacing the elder races, land made survivable through generations of monster suppression, and a political environment stable enough to support the kind of centralized, expansionist state Nilfgaard eventually became. Even regional powers with less central importance to the saga's main plot. The various duchies, free cities, and smaller territories scattered across the continent all depend on the same chain of causation. None of them could exist in anything resembling their current form without the specific and highly contingent sequence of events that started with the conjunction and continued through witches, human expansion, and centuries of political consolidation. Remove any single link from that chain, and the entire political map Geralt navigates simply wouldn't exist. This is worth sitting with, because it reframes how the political conflicts throughout the games should be understood. The war between the Northern Kingdoms and Nilfgaard isn't simply a story about two powers with competing ambitions. It's a story that could only happen because a cosmic catastrophe 1500 years earlier had created the specific conditions, monsters, witches, human expansion, and elven displacement that eventually produced both sides of that conflict in the first place. Part 66. Why witches could only exist after the conjunction. It's worth drawing the complete chain of causation together one final time, specifically focused on witches, because their existence represents perhaps the clearest and most direct link between the conjunction and any single institution that followed it. Every step in this chain depends entirely on the one before it, and removing any single link makes the profession's eventual creation genuinely impossible rather than simply less likely. The chain begins with the arrival of monsters, creatures from other spheres deposited onto a continent with no natural predators or ecological checks capable of controlling their population. This unprecedented threat, unlike anything the pre-conjunction continent had ever needed to contend with, is the first and most essential link. Without monsters at this scale and this level of danger, there's no crisis severe enough to justify the kind of radical solution witches eventually represented. That crisis, sustained across generations and consistently unresolved by conventional soldiers, mercenaries, priests, or the limited number of available mages, produced the desperation necessary for kingdoms to fund and support research as ethically troubling as Alzor's mutation experiments. No conventional threat, however severe, would have justified the human cost involved in developing the trial of the grasses. Only a threat this persistent, this widespread, and this consistently unsolvable by every existing method could have created the conditions under which such an extreme solution started to look acceptable to the people funding it. The specific techniques that made witches possible also depended directly on chaos, itself a direct product of the conjunction, rather than something that existed on the continent beforehand. Alzor's mutations relied on magical and alchemical methods that drew on this same force, meaning that even the mechanism used to create witches traces back to the same catastrophic event that had created the monsters those witches would eventually be trained to fight. What this complete chain demonstrates, more clearly than any single piece of it in isolation, is that witches weren't simply a response to circumstances the conjunction happened to create. They were a direct and necessary consequence of it, impossible without the specific combination of monster crisis and magical capability that only existed because the spheres had collided 1500 years earlier. Remove the conjunction from this history, and there is no version of the Witcher saga where witches exist at all, because there would never have been a reason, or a means, to create them. Part 67. The conjunction and the balance between chaos and nature. Chaos didn't simply arrive on the continent as an isolated magical resource sitting apart from everything else. Its introduction reshaped the fundamental relationship between magic and the natural world itself, weaving itself into the biology, the ecology, and the underlying rules governing what was and wasn't possible across an environment that had, before the conjunction, operated according to considerably simpler and more predictable natural laws. This entanglement shows up most directly in the existence of magical creatures, whose biology depends on chaos in ways ordinary animals never would. Certain monster species aren't simply dangerous predators. They're creatures whose abilities, resistances, or unusual physiology only make sense within a world already saturated by chaos, suggesting that the force didn't merely coexist alongside the continent's post-conjunction ecology, but actively shaped how that ecology developed once the initial monster population had established itself across the land. Mutations, both the deliberate kind Alza pioneered in creating witches, and the more chaotic, accidental variety that occasionally produces unpredictable magical creatures, similarly depend on chaos as their underlying mechanism. Before the conjunction, nothing resembling this kind of biological transformation was possible on the continent, because the force that made it achievable simply didn't exist yet. Chaos didn't just enable spellcasting, it made an entirely new category of transformation possible, one that reshaped bodies rather than simply directing energy toward external effects. Curses, another persistent feature of the post-conjunction continent, follow a similar pattern. Whatever mechanism allows a curse to reshape a person's fate, body, or fortune across generations depends on the same underlying force that arrived through the conjunction, another example of how thoroughly chaos rewrote the rules governing what the natural world could and couldn't do. The continent Geralt navigates isn't simply a world with magic added on top of ordinary natural laws. It's a world where magic and nature have become genuinely entangled, inseparable in ways that trace directly back to the same catastrophic arrival. Portals, the unstable remnants of what the Elle once possessed in a far more controlled form, complete this picture, representing the clearest surviving evidence of how thoroughly the conjunction blurred the line between the natural and the supernatural. What emerges from examining all of this together is a continent where nature itself was permanently altered by the arrival of chaos, not merely supplemented by it. An understanding that entanglement is essential to understanding why magic in this world feels so woven into the fabric of reality, rather than existing as a separate and clearly bounded system layered on top of it. Part 68. The greatest misconceptions about the conjunction. After tracing this history in as much careful detail as the confirmed lore allows, it's worth closing this section by directly addressing some of the more common misconceptions that circulate around the conjunction of the spheres, separating what popular retellings often assume from what the books and games actually establish. This matters because these misconceptions, repeated often enough across fan discussion, can start to feel like settled canon, even when the source material never actually confirmed them. One persistent misconception treats the conjunction as a deliberate act, something caused intentionally by a specific faction or individual pursuing a particular goal. The confirmed lore doesn't support this. Both continuities treat the conjunction as closer to a natural catastrophe, a failure of the boundaries between spheres, rather than a plan any character or civilization carried out on purpose. Theories suggesting deliberate causation, however popular in fan discussion, remain speculation rather than anything the source material has confirmed. Another common assumption treats the number and nature of the affected worlds as more fully mapped out than the lore actually provides. Fans have, over the years, filled in considerable detail about spheres the games only gesture toward briefly, assigning names, cultures, and histories to worlds the source material leaves almost entirely undefined. This kind of elaboration can be enjoyable as speculation, but it shouldn't be mistaken for anything the games or books have actually confirmed about the true scope of what the conjunction affected. A third misconception involves treating the White Frost as a single, consistent threat across both the books and the games, when in fact, as covered earlier in this history, The two continuities present meaningfully different versions of what that threat actually is and how it connects to the conjunction. Blending these two versions into a single account, without acknowledging the divergence, produces a version of this mythology that neither the novels nor the games actually tell. What unites these misconceptions is a shared tendency to prefer tidy, fully resolved explanations over the genuine ambiguity the source material actually offers. The conjunction of the spheres was never meant to be a fully mapped, fully explained event. It was meant to function as much as mystery as history, a catastrophe whose exact mechanics remain deliberately obscured, even as its consequences are traced in exhaustive detail throughout everything that follows it. Respecting that ambiguity, rather than papering over it with invented certainty, is essential to understanding this history accurately. Part 69. The complete timeline before the conjunction. Bringing this entire history to its close means first reconstructing the full chronological shape of everything that happened, starting with the ancient world that existed before any of the catastrophe's consequences began. This period, the longest stretch of time covered anywhere in this account, saw gnomes establish themselves first on the continent, followed by dwarves arriving from origins the lore never fully clarifies, and the two races settling into a coexistence defined more by mutual tolerance than by any grand alliance or shared ambition. Roughly 1,000 years before humanity's own arrival, the Seidhe crossed onto the continent by sea, encountering a land already inhabited by gnomes and dwarves, and establishing dominance over both through a combination of magical superiority and simple longevity. Their civilization rose considerably over the following centuries, building cities and towers that would remain standing, in ruined form, all the way into Geralt's own era, evidence of just how far beyond the Elder race's earlier achievements the elves had managed to build. In parallel, on an entirely separate world, the branch of elves who would become the Elle developed their own civilization, centered eventually around Ithlinne, mastering a form of interdimensional travel considerably more stable and reliable than anything that would exist across the universe once the conjunction eventually arrived. Their long war against the unicorns native to their adopted world unfolded during this same period, a conflict whose consequences would echo, indirectly, all the way through to Ciri's own story many centuries later. Magic during this entire span operated according to older and quieter principles than what chaos would eventually introduce. Tied closely to the natural world and largely inaccessible to anyone outside the elven races, who held a monopoly on meaningful magical practice throughout most of this ancient period. The balance that existed across the continent during these centuries, imperfect and hierarchical as it was, represented the last extended stretch of stability the world would know before everything changed. This is the starting point every subsequent part of this history builds from. A continent and a separate Elle world both existing in relative isolation, each shaped by its own internal history, neither aware of what was coming, and neither prepared for the collision that would, within a relatively compressed span of catastrophic time, permanently end the stability both worlds had spent centuries establishing. Part 70. The complete timeline of the conjunction. The catastrophe itself, when it finally arrived, unfolded with a speed that stands in sharp contrast to the centuries of stability that had preceded it. The boundaries separating countless isolated spheres of existence failed. Not gradually, but within a compressed and violent window of time, and every world touched by that failure found itself suddenly and permanently connected to realities it had never previously had any contact with or awareness of. Landscapes bled into each other during this collision. Entire stretches of terrain and the creatures native to them displaced wholesale into unfamiliar environments with no warning and no capacity to adapt gradually. Monsters from countless different spheres found themselves scattered across the continent specifically, arriving into an ecosystem with no natural predators or evolutionary history capable of accounting for their presence, an absence of resistance that would define the following centuries of continental history. Humanity's arrival unfolded across this same general window, though not as a single unified event. Earlier waves arrived during the catastrophe itself, their original world destroyed in the same collision that scattered everything else. while the later and more consequential wave, the Nordlings whose arrival history would eventually call the First Landing, reached the continent considerably afterward, stepping into a world already reshaped by centuries of post-conjunction chaos rather than arriving into the immediate aftermath. Chaos entered the continent during this same catastrophic window, saturating the environment with a magical force that hadn't existed there before, and that would eventually reshape everything from spellcasting to the biology of certain monster species. This arrival happened alongside, rather than separately from, the displacement of monsters and populations, part of the same singular catastrophic event rather than a distinct occurrence that followed it afterward. What makes this stretch of the timeline so difficult to fully map, even after everything covered across this account, is the sheer compression of everything that happened within it. Centuries worth of consequence, monsters, humans, and chaos, all arriving essentially simultaneously, unfolded within a window short enough that nobody who lived through it could have fully processed what was happening until the immediate catastrophe had already passed and the permanent transformation of the continent had already become an unavoidable and irreversible fact. Part 71, the complete timeline after the conjunction. Following the initial catastrophe, the centuries that unfolded across the continent followed the long, gradual arc traced in detail throughout the middle sections of this history. Humanity's earliest, most precarious settlements slowly consolidated into villages, and villages eventually into the first proto-kingdoms, a process driven by humanity's rapid reproductive rate and accelerated considerably once witches began making previously unusable land safe enough for genuine expansion. Magic underwent its own parallel development across this same span, moving from the dangerous and largely unstructured early experimentation of the first mages toward increasingly formalized practice, eventually producing the institutions that would culminate, many centuries later, in the Brotherhood of Sorcerers. This development ran alongside, and was directly enabled by, the same growing kingdoms whose courts increasingly relied on skilled practitioners for governance, medicine, and warfare alike. Witches emerged from the specific and desperate circumstances covered in detail earlier in this history. Alsur's controversial research building on Cosimo Malaspina's earlier foundational work, eventually producing the Trial of the Grasses and the first generation of survivors capable of matching monsters on something closer to equal terms. Their emergence marked a genuine turning point, transforming the monster crisis from an unsolvable existential threat into a persistent but manageable feature of continental life. The Northern Kingdoms and Nilfgaard both rose out of the sustained expansion this transformation eventually made possible, developing over centuries into the distinct and increasingly rival political powers that would define the continent's landscape by the time Geralt was born. Meanwhile, the elder races experienced a parallel and considerably less fortunate arc, gradually displaced from dominance into marginalization as human territory and population continued expanding at a pace nothing in elven history had prepared them to counter. On the other side of the same original catastrophe, the Elle spent this same span of centuries confined to their own world, developing the genetic program that would eventually produce Lara Doran and, generations later, Ciri, alongside the military structure that would evolve into the Wild Hunt under Eridan's eventual leadership. By the time this long stretch of parallel development finally converged, in the events surrounding Ciri's own life, 15 centuries had passed since the original collision, and both halves of this divided history were about to collide with each other just as completely as the spheres themselves once had. Part 72. Every major character connected to the conjunction. It's worth naming plainly, one final time, exactly how each major figure across this saga connects back to the same root event, because the connections run deeper and more directly than a casual understanding of the series might suggest. Alzur exists as a character only because the conjunction created a monster crisis severe enough to justify his radical and ethically troubling research. And without that crisis, his considerable magical talent would likely have been remembered for something else entirely, if it was remembered at all. Lara Doran's entire existence traces directly back to the NL's genetic program, itself a direct response to the interdimensional travel the conjunction had stripped from her people generations before her birth. Her relationship with Cregennan of Lod, and the tragedy that followed when she chose him over the future the Ainel sages had arranged for her, only becomes possible within a history already reshaped by the conjunction's original catastrophe. Avallac'h's entire centuries-spanning arc, from Lara's intended husband to Ciri's eventual mentor, exists because of this same chain of consequence. Eridan's rise within the Red Riders, and his eventual command of what would become the Wild Hunt, reflects the same underlying wound. A civilization still grieving what the conjunction had taken from it, still searching for restoration 15 centuries later. Geralt himself, for all that his own personal story might seem, on the surface, disconnected from any of this ancient cosmic history, exists as a witcher only because Alzur's research, itself downstream of the conjunction, produced the profession he'd eventually be trained into. Vesemir's entire life as a witcher and mentor depends on the same foundation, an institution that wouldn't exist without the conjunction's monster crisis, creating the desperate need for it in the first place. And Ciri, standing at the convergence point of nearly every thread traced throughout this entire account, connects to the conjunction more directly than any other figure in the saga, carrying in her own body the genetic legacy of a project the Elle began generations before her birth, in direct response to a catastrophe that occurred 1,500 years before that. What emerges from tracing these individual connections is confirmation of something this history has argued from its opening section onward. These characters aren't simply operating within a world the conjunction happened to create as a backdrop. Their individual stories, their choices, their tragedies, and their triumphs are directly shaped in traceable and specific ways by consequences that catastrophic events set in motion 15 centuries before any of them were born, connecting figures separated by enormous spans of time into a single, continuous chain of cause and effect. Part 73. Every major conflict created by the conjunction. Examining the saga's major conflicts with this full history in mind reveals the same underlying pattern that's defined nearly everything traced throughout this account. The racial tension between humans and elves, running from the earliest post-conjunction displacement all the way through to the persecution Geralt witnesses in Novigrad and the Desperate. Losing guerrilla war the Scoia'tael waged throughout the games traces directly back to the demographic pressure humanity's conjunction-driven arrival eventually generated. The war between the Northern Kingdoms and Nilfgaard, dominating so much of the political backdrop across all three games, depends entirely on both powers having developed into the kind of large, organized states capable of sustaining continental-scale warfare, a development that itself depended on witches making lands safe enough for the population growth that eventually produced kingdoms this large. Remove the conjunction, and there's no monster crisis severe enough to necessitate witches. No witches to enable this scale of expansion, and consequently no conflict of this scale between North and South. Magical rivalries throughout the saga, the internal politics of the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, the Lodge of Sorceresses, and the various factional disputes that shape so much of the political intrigue Geralt navigates, all depend on chaos existing as a resource worth fighting over in the first place. A force that arrived on the continent through the same catastrophic collision that produced everything else traced throughout this history. The dimensional conflict that eventually defines Witcher 3's central plot, Eridan's pursuit of Ciri and the Wild Hunt's broader ambitions, represents perhaps the most direct connection of any conflict in the entire saga, since it's not simply enabled by the conjunction's consequences, but is, in a very real sense, still actively working through the original catastrophe's unresolved aftermath. The Elves' wound never healed, and their pursuit of Ciri represents their final, most consequential attempt at healing it. What ties all of these conflicts together, despite their apparent variety, is the same shared route this entire history has traced from its opening section onward. Nearly every major source of tension throughout the Witcher saga, racial, political, magical, and dimensional alike, exists because of consequences the conjunction of the spheres set in motion 1,500 years before any of these specific conflicts erupted, demonstrating just how thoroughly one ancient catastrophe continues shaping the shape of every war and rivalry that follows it. Part 74. Why the conjunction still shapes the future. Even as Witcher 3's events draw the main saga toward its conclusion, nothing about the conjunction's influence over the continent's future has actually ended. The elder blood, carried forward through Seidhe and potentially through any children she might eventually have, remains a living genetic legacy, capable of shaping events for generations still to come. A direct and ongoing extension of the same lineage the Elle began cultivating centuries before her birth. Dimensional instability. The unresolved and imperfectly sealed boundaries between worlds that this history has repeatedly returned to shows no sign of having been fully resolved by anything that happens across the trilogy's events. Portals remain unstable. The mechanisms the Elle spent centuries trying to restore remain, even after everything Seidhe accomplishes, imperfectly understood and imperfectly controlled, suggesting that whatever the conjunction broke 15 centuries ago has never been fully repaired, regardless of how the saga's immediate conflicts happen to resolve. Monsters, as covered earlier in this account, show no realistic prospect of disappearing from the continent entirely, meaning the ecological consequences of the original catastrophe remain a permanent and ongoing feature of continental life, rather than a crisis any single story's conclusion could plausibly resolve. Future generations, whatever else changes about the continent's political landscape, will continue living alongside the same fundamental threat that's defined the world since the conjunction first scattered these creatures across it. Magical research, similarly, shows no indication of having reached any kind of final or complete understanding of chaos and its origins by the point the main saga concludes. Mages continue studying, continue refining technique, continue occasionally stumbling into dangerous new discoveries about what chaos can do. A continuation that suggests the full consequences of the conjunction's arrival remain, even after 15 centuries, an ongoing and unfinished subject of study, rather than a settled and fully understood piece of history. What all of this suggests, taken together, is that the conjunction's influence was never confined to ancient history in the way a more contained catastrophe might have been. Its consequences remain woven into the ongoing, unresolved fabric of continental life, still shaping political ambition, still driving magical research, still defining the ecological reality every character in this saga has to navigate. The conjunction didn't simply happen once, 1,500 years before Geralt's birth, and then recede into background history. It continues happening, in slow motion, through every consequence this account has traced, and there's no clear indication, anywhere in either the books or the games, that this ongoing influence is anywhere close to finished. Part 75. The complete history of the conjunction of the spheres. This account began in the quiet before any of it happened. Countless isolated spheres of existence, each developing on its own terms, none aware that a collision was coming that would end their isolation permanently. It traced the gnomes and dwarves who first called the continent home, the elves who arrived by sea and built a civilization that would dominate the land for 1,000 years, and the separate branch of that same elven people who settled another world entirely and mastered, for a time, a genuine freedom of movement between spheres that the rest of the universe never came close to matching. It followed the catastrophe itself, the boundaries between countless worlds failing at once, monsters and humans and an entirely new magical force all arriving on the continent within the same compressed and violent window of transformation. It traced the long, difficult centuries that followed, human settlements slowly consolidating into kingdoms, magic developing from dangerous accident into structured practice, and the desperate crisis of an unchecked monster population eventually producing, through Alzur's controversial and costly research, the first witches the continent had ever seen. It followed the northern kingdoms and Nilfgaard rising out of the expansion witches made possible. The elder races declining under the weight of that same expansion, and on the other side of the original catastrophe, the ANL's own long and separate suffering, their loss of interdimensional travel driving centuries of search and sacrifice that eventually produced the Elder Blood, Lara Dorren, and the military structure that would become the Wild Hunt under Eridan's eventual command. And it followed all of these separate threads converging, finally, on Seidhe, standing at the center of consequences that had been building since long before her birth, carrying an inheritance that connected the immediate present of Geralt's own story all the way back to a catastrophe that occurred 1,500 years earlier. A catastrophe that most of the continent's inhabitants had long since, stopped consciously thinking about, even as they continued living entirely within its aftermath. Without the conjunction of the spheres, there is no continent as Geralt would recognize it. No monsters to hunt, no witches to hunt them. No northern kingdoms, no Nilfgaard, no elder blood, no wild hunt, and no Ciri standing at the end of a chain of consequence 15 centuries in the making. Every race, every kingdom, every conflict, and every character this history has touched exists because worlds collided once, long before any of their stories began, and transformed isolated realities into a single, shared, and permanently altered universe. That single event remains, even now, the true origin point of everything the Witcher saga has ever told.